Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Sleepy Medievals. Tonight, we journey through time to an age where faith and steel intertwined, where dreams of Jerusalem haunted the sleeping minds of Europe, and where the dust of ancient roads still carries whispers of devotion and regret. The Crusades, a quiet journey through faith, war, and forgotten dust. As you settle in for the night, take a moment to dim your lights if you haven't already. Find that perfect position in your bed or on your couch where your body can truly release the weight of today. Perhaps pull your blanket a little higher, creating that cocoon of warmth that invites rest. The history we'll explore tonight spans centuries, but you have all the time in the world to drift away whenever sleep calls to you. Let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I always find it fascinating how these histories reach across different time zones, connecting us across continents, just as the Crusades once connected distant worlds, though hopefully with gentler consequences. It's an odd irony that we find comfort in stories of such tumult. The Crusades embody one of humanity's most profound contradictions. How the purest impulse toward the divine can lead to both transcendent beauty and unspeakable cruelty. How the same hands that built soaring cathedrals also wielded swords in foreign lands. How pilgrims seeking spiritual salvation brought earthly ruin to countless souls along their path. Tonight, we'll walk these contradictions together. We'll feel the weight of chainmail on tired shoulders. We'll hear the mingled prayers in Latin and Arabic that rose from the same stones. We'll trace the journey of people who left everything behind for a Jerusalem that existed more perfectly in their dreams than it ever could in reality. This isn't a history of dates and battles, though those will gently guide our path. This is a history of feelings, of fear and wonder, of homesickness and strange new horizons, of convictions so strong they could move thousands across continents, and of doubts that crept in during the quietest moments of night watches. Only, if this calms you and helps ease your mind into restful sleep, consider subscribing to the channel. The notification bell is there too, quiet and patient should you wish to press it. But there's no hurry, no pressure. These histories have waited centuries for us. They'll still be here tomorrow. As we prepare to step back into the 11th century, remember that the voices we'll hear tonight have long since fallen silent. The triumphs and tragedies we'll witness have been smoothed by time like pebbles in a stream, their sharp edges worn down by the passing of nearly 1,000 years, yet something of their essence remains, in stone walls still standing, in words preserved on yellowed pages, in traditions that outlived their creators. The Crusades began with a call that rippled across Europe, spoken by one man but echoed by thousands. They would span nearly 2 centuries, leaving marks on 3 continents and countless souls. They would see Jerusalem captured and lost, then captured and lost again, as if the holy city itself rejected the notion of being possessed by any single faith or people. But before the battles, before the long marches and desperate sieges, before Jerusalem's walls ran with blood, there were just people. People with hopes and dreams, with fears and failings. People who woke each morning and wondered what the day might bring, just as we do now. So close your eyes if you wish. Let your breathing slow. We're about to journey back to a world lit by fire rather than electricity, measured by seasons rather than clocks, bound by faith rather than science. The sheets beneath you will become the starting point for our voyage, not to the Holy Land itself, but to a time when the Holy Land called, and thousands answered. You wake in the dark. Of a medieval home, the straw mattress beneath you crackles with your movement, a sound so different from the springs or memory foam that cradle you in your real bed. Above, the wooden beams of the ceiling are nearly invisible in the pre-dawn gloom, darkened by years of smoke from the hearth that provides the home's only warmth and cooking fire. That smoke hangs in the air still, mingling with the earthier sense of a world without modern sanitation or processing. A world more immediate, more tangible in its sensory presence. Outside, a church bell tolls prime, the first prayer of the day. The sound washes over the village, not a recorded chime or electronic tone, but the physical vibration of metal struck by metal, waves of sound pulsing through the early morning air. This is how time is measured in your new reality. By prayers, by sunlight, by the rhythmic repetitions of the church that structures every aspect of existence. You rise and dress in simple garments, coarse linen against your skin, perhaps wool if the morning carries a chill. No synthetic fabrics, no elastics or zippers, just cloth shaped roughly to the human form, secured with ties or simple buttons carved from bone or wood. Your feet find leather shoes, if you're fortunate enough to own them. Otherwise, perhaps, wooden clogs, or simply the earth beneath calloused soles. The year is 1095, though few around you would identify it as such in casual conversation. It is the year of our Lord, 1095. But more importantly, to the people of this time, it is simply the present, a moment in an unfolding Christian story that began with creation and will end, perhaps soon, with judgment. The past stretches behind, marked by saints' days and monarchs' reigns. The future is both predetermined by God's will and terrifyingly uncertain in its earthly details. You step outside into a world defined by its boundaries. The village around you contains perhaps a few hundred souls, many of whom will never travel more than 20 miles from where they were born. The horizon is not an abstraction, but a very real limit to knowledge. Beyond lies uncertainty, danger, difference. Maps, if they exist at all, show Jerusalem at the center of all things, with monsters populating the margins of the known world. Yet even in this bounded existence, rumors travel. Strange news has been filtering westward for months now. The Byzantine emperor, ruler of the great Christian city of Constantinople, has sent word to the Pope. The holy places of Christendom are threatened. Jerusalem, where Christ walked and taught and died and rose again, has been under Muslim rule for centuries, but now a new threat has emerged. The Seljuk Turks have taken control of much of the Holy Land, replacing the more tolerant rule of previous Arab dynasties. Christian pilgrims are being harassed or prevented from visiting the sacred sites. These stories reach your village distorted, amplified, transformed. Around the communal well, at the tavern, after Sunday Mass, people gather to exchange what they've heard, each retelling adding new details, new urgencies. The Holy Sepulchre, the very tomb of Christ, desecrated. Pilgrims forced to pay extortionate taxes or subjected to humiliations. Christian communities in the East crying out for salvation. How much is true? In this world before mass communication, before literacy was common, before the verification of sources was even a concept, truth is malleable, emotional, relational. What matters is not the precise accuracy of each claim, but how the stories resonate with existing fears and hopes, how they fit into the great narrative of Christian struggle against outside threats, and the fears run deep. Your world is precarious. Failed harvests, disease, local warfare, any of these could bring suffering or death. The average lifespan is half what yours will be in the future. Child mortality is devastatingly common. Physical pain is a daily companion for many, with medical knowledge limited and often ineffective. In such a reality, spiritual explanations provide the framework for understanding suffering. Sin, penance, divine punishment, and divine mercy shape how people interpret their hardships. But there is beauty here too, and moments of transcendent joy that your modern world, for all its comforts, might struggle to match. When the village celebrates a wedding or harvest festival, the community truly comes together. bound by shared experience and necessity. When the traveling minstrel arrives with news and songs from distant places, imaginations soar beyond the village boundaries. When the light streams through the small church's single stained glass window, painting colors across stone floors, heaven seems to touch earth for a moment. And the church is everywhere, in everything, not just the building at the village center, but the rhythm of days and seasons, the explanation for natural phenomena, the arbiter of morality, the keeper of knowledge, the connection to a wider world of faith. The church binds Christendom together across language barriers and political divisions. A monk from Ireland could travel to Italy and still participate in the same Latin Mass, still recognize the same saints and rituals, still feel part of the same universal body of Christ. This universality will become crucial in the months to come, because something unprecedented is stirring. Pope Urban II has called for a great council at Clermont in France. Bishops, abbots and nobles are gathering to discuss matters of church reform and discipline. But rumors suggest something more momentous is brewing, a response to those Eastern pleas perhaps, something that will reach beyond church politics and into the lives of ordinary faithful Christians. You feel it in the air, like the electric tension before a storm. Something is coming, something that will draw people from their small, bounded worlds and set them on roads they never imagined traveling. Something that will promise salvation and adventure in equal measure. As autumn progresses and the harvest is gathered in, the tension grows. Travelers bring fragments of news from the council. The Pope himself has spoken. A great journey is being called for, a pilgrimage, but also a military expedition, a journey to liberate the Holy Land, a chance for remission of sins, a path to salvation through warfare sanctified by divine purpose. Deus vult, God wills it. The word spread from village to village, from church to church, from heart to heart. God wills it. And just like that, the boundaries of your medieval world begin to expand. The horizon is no longer the limit of ambition. Jerusalem, distant, mysterious, holy Jerusalem, has entered the realm of possibility. For some, it will become an obsession. For others, an opportunity. For many, a fatal destination they will never reach. You stand at the threshold of one of history's great movements of people and faith. The first crusade is beginning, not with marching armies, but with whispers, with dreams, with the invisible promptings of belief. The world you woke to is about to change forever. The world is both larger and smaller than you think. Larger in the vastness of its unknown territories, in the weeks and months required to traverse distances we now cover in hours. Smaller in how isolated communities remain, how limited the exchange of ideas and goods, how tightly bound most lives are to the soil that feeds them. This 11th century exists in a curious balance of connection and separation. Three great civilizations share the Mediterranean basin, each viewing itself as the true inheritor of Roman greatness, each centering its identity on a different faith, yet each unknowingly dependent on the others for trade, knowledge, and self-definition. In the East, the Byzantine Empire persists as the direct continuation of Roman imperial power. Constantinople, a city of perhaps 500,000 souls, dwarfs any urban center in Western Europe. Its walls, triple-layered and massive, have protected it for centuries. Within those walls, the Emperor Alexios Komnenos rules over what remains of a once greater realm, his authority derived from an unbroken line of succession stretching back to Constantine himself. The Byzantines call themselves Romans, Romeoi, though they speak Greek rather than Latin. Their Eastern Orthodox Christianity centers on magnificent rituals conducted beneath the vast dome of Hagia Sophia, where gold mosaics catch the light of thousands of oil lamps, and the emperor himself is considered God's viceroy on earth. Icons, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin, and saints adorn homes and churches alike, serving as windows into the divine realm. But Byzantium is troubled. The catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071 opened Anatolia, the empire's heartland, to Seljuk Turkish expansion. Imperial borders are contracting. Resources are strained. The professional army that long secured Byzantine preeminence has been reduced, forcing greater reliance on mercenaries. Emperor Alexios, though brilliant and determined, faces threats from all sides. To the south and east lies the Islamic world, itself divided into competing powers. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the unquestioned leader of the Muslim lands, has declined to a ceremonial role in Baghdad, while real power has fragmented among various sultanates and emirates. The Fatimid Caliphate controls Egypt and parts of Syria, including Jerusalem. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, have established dominance across Persia and much of the former Byzantine territory in Anatolia. Despite political fragmentation, Islamic civilization flourishes intellectually. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars preserve and expand upon ancient Greek knowledge that has been largely lost to the West. Advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry proceed alongside sophisticated theological debates. Poetry and architecture reach new heights of refinement. The Islamic world's paper-making technology, learned from China, enables a book trade that far outpaces Europe's laboriously copied manuscripts. Muslims of this era might pray 5 times, daily facing Mecca, but they inhabit diverse communities. Christians and Jews live as dhimmis, protected religious minorities, required to pay special taxes and accept certain limitations, but generally free to practice their faiths and participate in economic life. The level of tolerance varies by region and ruler. Some enclaves maintain remarkable interfaith cooperation. Elsewhere, restrictions are more onerous. In the Western Mediterranean and Northern Europe, the heirs of Charlemagne's fractured empire are slowly consolidating into what will eventually become nation-states. For now, power is decentralized under the feudal system, a complex web of obligations binding lords and vassals together in hierarchies of loyalty and service. A patchwork of duchies, counties, and smaller fiefdoms creates a constantly shifting political landscape where today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. The most powerful Western ruler, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, finds himself locked in conflict with the papacy over the question of who has the right to appoint bishops, a struggle not merely theological but economic and political, since bishops control vast lands and resources. This investiture controversy has seen Emperor Henry, humiliated at Canossa, forced to wait barefoot in the snow for Pope Gregory VII's forgiveness. The current Pope, Urban II, continues to assert papal supremacy over secular authority. Across these Western lands, the Church has been undergoing reform, attempting to address corruption and enforce clerical celibacy. Monasteries follow the rule of Saint Benedict, creating centers of learning and spiritual devotion. The Cluniac reforms have reinvigorated monastic life, establishing a network of abbeys that answer directly to the Pope rather than local bishops or nobles. Daily life, for most Europeans, revolves around agriculture and the Christian calendar. In villages and manors, peasants work the land using methods barely changed for centuries. Wooden plows, ox teams, hand sickles for harvest. Crop rotation is practiced, but yields remain low, making failed harvests and subsequent famines a recurring danger. Most peasants are serfs, not slaves, but bound to the land and obligated to provide labor and a portion of their harvest to their lord in exchange for protection. Towns are growing in importance, however. Trade routes are gradually reopening. Merchants and artisans organize into guilds to protect their interests. Cathedral schools provide education for those destined for the clergy, while knights train from childhood in the martial skills needed for their role as the warrior elite. Noble children might learn to read Latin, but literacy remains primarily a clerical attribute. For most people, knowledge comes through oral tradition and the visual teachings of church art and ritual. Across all these regions, daily sensory experience differs profoundly from our modern world. Darkness is real and complete when the sun sets, alleviated only by firelight or expensive candles and oil lamps. Silence can be profound, unbroken by mechanical sounds. Yet human environments are rarely quiet. Voices, animals, craft activities, bells marking the hours of prayer create a soundscape now lost to us. Scents are more pronounced and less processed. Smoke, animals, human bodies, food preparation, tanning and dyeing create olfactory landscapes both richer and more challenging than our sanitized modern spaces. Textiles are fewer but more valued. A fine piece of silk might be worth more than a house, while even ordinary clothing represents significant labor in spinning, weaving, and sewing. Pain is a more constant companion. Dental problems, digestive disorders, injuries that never fully heal, these are common across all social classes. Life expectancy is short, with many children never reaching adulthood. Yet this omnipresence of suffering and death shapes a worldview where the afterlife seems as real and immediate as earthly existence. Salvation is not an abstract concept, but an urgent, personal concern. In this world of embodied experience and limited horizons, Jerusalem occupies a unique place in the Christian imagination. Though few have seen it, all know it through Bible, stories, sermons, and the accounts of returning pilgrims. It is where Christ walked, taught, died, and rose again. It is the navel of the world, the physical center of God's creation. It is where, many believe, the last judgment will take place when Christ returns. And Jerusalem is under Muslim control, has been for over 4 centuries. Generally, Christian pilgrims have been permitted to visit the holy sites, particularly under the relatively tolerant Fatimid rulers. But recent decades have seen increasing difficulties. The Seljuk conquest of Jerusalem in 1073, though it would return to Fatimid control by the time of the First Crusade, brought stricter policies. Tales of pilgrims harassed, churches desecrated, and Christians persecuted filter back to Europe, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Distance becomes destiny. The very remoteness of Jerusalem makes it an ideal canvas for European fears and hopes. Its liberation becomes a symbol for spiritual renewal, a focus for anxieties about Muslim expansion, and eventually, a solution to internal European problems that no one yet fully understands. The air in Clermont carries the weight of anticipation. It is late November 1095, and the small French city has swelled beyond its capacity with visitors. Prelates in rich vestments, nobles with their retinues, ordinary clerics, and curious townspeople have all gathered for the church council called by Pope Urban II. For 10 days, the council has addressed internal church matters: simony, clerical, marriage, the ongoing investiture dispute with the German emperor. Important issues, certainly, but not the reason why the crowds have grown each day, why people whisper that something momentous is brewing. Now, on November 27th, the Pope has called for an open-air meeting. The council hall cannot contain the numbers who wish to hear him. They spill out into a field just outside the city gates. Thousands upon thousands, their breath visible in the autumn chill. You stand among them, feet cold on the frosted ground, ears straining to catch the words of the man who leads the Western Church. Pope Urban II is not physically imposing. A man in his late 50s, ascetic in build after years of monastic discipline. But when he rises to speak, his voice carries surprising strength. He stands on a wooden platform, surrounded by cardinals and bishops in their ceremonial robes. The papal cross is held aloft nearby, a visual reminder of his authority as the Vicar of Christ. He begins with the troubles of the East. His words paint a picture of Byzantine Christians under threat, of the holy places defiled, of pilgrims abused. He speaks of churches converted to stables, of Christian altars desecrated, of unspeakable cruelties committed against Eastern Christians. With each sentence, his rhetoric builds, his descriptions become more vivid, more horrifying. Many in the crowd make the sign of the cross, murmuring prayers for those suffering so far away. The Pope's voice grows more passionate. This is not merely a recitation of distant tragedies. This is a call to action. The Christians of the West must aid their Eastern brethren. The holy places of Jerusalem must be liberated from Muslim control. Christ's tomb itself must be reclaimed. "Oh, race of Franks!" he cries, addressing the French nobles directly. "Race from across the mountains, race beloved and chosen by God. Stand forth for Christ's sake as defenders of the Church." The crowd stirs. The Pope continues, his words carefully, chosen to resonate with different listeners in different ways. For the knights and nobles, he offers a redirection of their martial energies. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. For the common folk suffering under noble oppression, he hints at escape. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. For the greedy, he suggests wealth. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honor. But above all, he offers something no earthly power could grant: remission of sins. This is not just a war, but a pilgrimage. Those who go to liberate Jerusalem with right intention will have their penance remitted, in an age when sin and its eternal consequences weigh heavily on every soul. This promise cuts through all other considerations. The Pope's voice reaches its crescendo. "God wills it," he exclaims. And then a miracle occurs, or so it will be remembered. From thousands of throats, spontaneously the cry is returned, "Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it!" The words roll across the field like thunder, like the voice of God himself confirming the Pope's message. Men fall to their knees. Some weep openly. Others embrace their neighbors in the shared emotion of the moment. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, standing near the Pope, is the first to take up the cross, literally. He kneels before Urban, pledging himself to the cause. Others follow immediately, nobles pushing forward to make their vows, to have crosses of cloth sewn onto their garments as visible signs of their commitment. The Crusade, though it is not yet called that, is born in a surge of collective emotion, unlike anything Europe has witnessed for generations. You watch, caught in the swell of feeling that passes through the crowd like a physical force. Faith in this age is not private or abstract, but embodied, communal, immediate. The people around you do not doubt that God has spoken through the Pope. They do not question that the liberation of Jerusalem is a divine mission. In this moment, heaven and earth seem to touch, and ordinary men glimpse a chance to participate in sacred history. Later, as the crowd disperses, the practical questions begin to emerge. When to depart? What route to take? How to provision such an undertaking? Who will lead? The Pope has set the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th of the following year, as the date for departure. 8 months to prepare for a journey of thousands of miles, with no clear understanding of what awaits at the end. The news spreads rapidly from Clermont, carried by those who witnessed the Pope's speech and by official letters to those who did not. Urban himself embarks on a preaching tour through France, repeating his call in different cities, adapting his message for different audiences. Other preachers take up the theme, sometimes embellishing the Pope's message with their own apocalyptic interpretations or promises not sanctioned by Urban himself. By spring, the call has reached even the most remote villages. It penetrates castle halls and peasant cottages, monasteries and markets. It transforms from a papal initiative into a movement that begins to exceed urban's ability to control or direct. The people have heard not just the Pope's specific call, but an answer to deeper yearnings for purpose, for salvation, for escape from the constraints of their lives. For the nobles and knights, the crusade offers a way to channel their martial skills into divine service, to gain lands and wealth, without the sin of fighting fellow Christians. For younger sons with no inheritance prospects, it promises adventure and opportunity. For the clergy, it represents the church militant fulfilling its divine mission. For merchants, it suggests new trade possibilities. For commoners, it hints at freedom from feudal obligations and a direct relationship with God, unmediated by the often corrupt local priesthood. And for all, it offers a story larger than their individual lives, a chance to be part of something cosmic and eternal, to write their names in heaven's ledger through one great act of devotion. In an age when life is often nasty, brutish, and short, when the material world offers little comfort and less security, the spiritual promise of the crusade shines like a beacon. Winter turns to spring, and spring begins to warm towards summer. In villages and towns across Europe, people sew crosses onto their garments with trembling fingers. Some weep as they do so, overcome by the magnitude of what they have pledged. Others work with grim determination or with joy, depending on what visions of Jerusalem fill their hearts. The first groups begin to gather, preparing to move east toward a destiny none can truly imagine. The words of Urban still echo. Deus vult. God wills it. But what exactly God wills, what awaits on the roads to Jerusalem, remains veiled in the mists of an unwritten future. A future that would prove far stranger, far bloodier, and far more contradictory than even the Pope himself could have foreseen. The preparations begin with both joyful fervour and silent dread. In castle halls, knights polish armour that has seen only tournaments and local skirmishes, now destined for distant battlefields. Sword edges are honed to razor sharpness by men, contemplating for the first time what it means to kill in God's name. Shields are repainted with crosses, transforming tools of self-protection into symbols of a divine mission. In village homes, women work by firelight, fingers calloused and nimble, sewing crosses of red cloth onto tunics and cloaks. Some work in silence, tears occasionally falling onto the fabric as they contemplate husbands, sons, or fathers who may never return. Others sing hymns or tell stories of Jerusalem as they stitch, investing the simple act with ritual significance. The cross transforms the wearer, marking them as both pilgrim and warrior, as someone who has already symbolically died to their old life and been reborn into sacred purpose. When she finished sewing the cross, she held the tunic to her chest. "Before giving it to him," whispers an old woman to her granddaughter, describing a scene from decades earlier when her own father departed for the Holy Land. She breathed her love into the cloth so that it might protect him when her arms could not. The young girl nods solemnly, watching her mother perform this same ritual for her father, the ancient gesture connecting 3 generations across time. The practical concerns are overwhelming. How does one prepare for a journey of such uncertain length and danger? What to bring? What to leave behind? How much food? How many coins? What clothes for unknown climates? For most, this will be the first time they have ever left their native region, let alone ventured into foreign lands with different languages, customs, foods, and dangers. Those with property make painful decisions. Lands must be sold to raise funds for the journey, often at ruinous prices as local markets flood with available properties. Some noble families mortgage everything they have, betting their entire patrimony on the promise of new lands in the east. Abbey ledgers fill with records of donations, knights granting their ancestral holdings to monasteries in exchange for prayers for their success and salvation. In the marketplace, Prices rise for everything the Crusaders might need: horses, mules, dried foods, leather goods, weapons. Some merchants charge fair prices, seeing it as their contribution to the holy cause. Others price gouge shamelessly, recognizing opportunity in the desperation of those committed to departure. A good warhorse now costs as much as a small farm. Sacks of grain disappear from storehouses, sometimes purchased legitimately, sometimes not. The social fabric stretches and tears in places. Peasants who take the cross assert their right to leave feudal obligations behind, creating tensions with lords who face losing their workforce. Marriages strain under the weight of impending separation. Creditors pursue debtors with increased urgency, knowing their chance for repayment may soon vanish over the eastern horizon. Criminal cases are hastily settled. Deathbed confessions heard, wills drafted, baptisms and weddings performed with a new sense of finality. Not everyone who takes the cross intends to honor the vow. Some see it as temporary protection from creditors or criminal charges. Others are caught up in the emotion of the moment, only to have second thoughts in the cold reality of dawn. The Church establishes penalties for those who take the cross falsely or turn back without fulfilling their pledge, but enforcement will prove difficult once the journey begins. As spring ripens into summer, the first groups begin to gather. The thatched Pope had envisioned an orderly departure after the Feast of the Assumption in August, with proper ecclesiastical and military leadership. Reality proves messier. Impatient bands form before the appointed time, unwilling to wait for official sanction or organization. Charismatic preachers gather followers independently of the papal plan. The movement has already grown beyond control, driven by forces deeper than policy or strategy. One such preacher is Peter the Hermit, a small wizened man with piercing eyes and wild hair, riding his donkey from village to village across northern France and the Rhineland. His eloquence is raw, emotional, apocalyptic, far removed from the measured tones of Pope Urban, but perhaps more effective at stirring the hearts of common people. Where Urban appealed primarily to nobles and knights, Peter speaks directly to peasants, artisans, and the urban poor, painting vivid pictures of Jerusalem's desecration and promising God's special protection for those who follow him eastward. By early spring, Peter has gathered thousands of followers, men, women, and even children, most with minimal provisions and no military training. They carry farming implements as weapons, wear homemade crosses, and sustain themselves through a combination of legitimate charity, forcible requisitioning, and outright pillage. They believe with perfect faith that God will provide for them, that the normal rules of warfare and survival do not apply to those carrying out divine will. More organized contingents prepare more methodically. Count Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest nobles of southern France, funds his expedition properly, gathering knights and sergeants who have trained together, ensuring adequate supplies and pack animals. Godfrey of Bouillon sells or mortgages his entire inheritance to fund his participation, assembling a formidable fighting force from the Lotharingian lands. Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the King of France, travels with royal prestige, if not royal funds. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman ruler in southern Italy, sees opportunity for new conquests to replace the lands that have eluded him in Byzantine territories. Each leader recruits from his own lands, creating armies unified more by regional ties than by any overarching command structure. Each brings his own ambitions alongside religious devotion. Each will follow his own path eastward, converging and diverging from other groups as circumstances dictate. The crusade is not one army but many. Not one journey but countless individual pilgrimages braided together by shared destination and purpose. The departures themselves become ritual moments, marked by special masses, by the blessing of weapons and standards, by processions that lead the Crusaders to the edge of familiar territory before the genuine journey begins. Families line these routes, weeping and cheering, offering final embraces, entrusting small tokens to be carried to Jerusalem, perhaps to be laid on Christ's tomb as proxy for those who cannot make the journey themselves. "Will you bring back a palm frond?" a child asks her departing father, referring to the palm branches that traditionally marked a completed pilgrimage. "God willing," the man replies, the familiar phrase carrying new weight in these circumstances. He does not voice his deeper thoughts, that he may never return at all, that his bones might rest in unknown soil far from his ancestors, that his child might grow to adulthood without him. Such fears must be surrendered along with all other worldly attachments. Jerusalem calls, and those who have taken the cross must answer, wherever that answer leads. Hope and fear share the same bed in these departure scenes. The hope is transcendent. Jerusalem regained, sins forgiven, a place secured in heaven's registry. The fear is primal, starvation, disease, violence, the lonely death far from home that haunts human nightmares across cultures and eras. Both emotions are real, both acknowledged in the tears that fall as the first Crusaders take their first steps eastward. What none can know as they depart, not the learned Pope, not the charismatic Peter, not the strategic nobles, certainly, not the humble foot soldiers of Christ, is that they are initiating a movement that will continue for centuries, reshaping the relationship between Christendom and the Islamic world, between East and West, in ways that continue to reverberate nearly a millennium later in our own time. For now, there is just the dust of the road rising behind them, the weight of belongings on their backs, the unfamiliar horizon before them, and Jerusalem shimmering in their minds like a mirage, distant, holy, calling them onwards step by step. Chaotic devotion has a beauty all its own. It lacks the ordered precision of trained armies, or the strategic coherence of campaigns planned in castle war rooms. Instead, it moves with the organic, unpredictable energy of a river in flood, powerful, unstoppable, and often destructive in ways its participants neither intend nor fully comprehend. The People's Crusade, history would later call it that, though those who marched under Peter the Hermit had no separate name for their endeavor, embodied faith at its most raw and unmediated. These were not the trained knights who would follow later under noble leadership. These were tanners and blacksmiths, bakers and shepherds, along with their wives and children in many cases. Some were genuine religious enthusiasts. Others were escaping debt, failed marriages or criminal charges. Many were simply desperate, seeing in the crusade a chance to escape lives of grinding poverty and limited horizons. God knows who belongs to him, Peter would say, when questioned about the motley nature of his followers. A small man with a weathered face and burning eyes, Peter had the charisma that transforms ordinary words into religious experience. When he spoke of Jerusalem's desecration, listeners didn't merely hear about distant events. They felt the nails piercing Christ's hands anew. They tasted the dust of the holy city on their tongues. They sensed angels and saints watching their response. By April 1096, Peter's band numbered perhaps 20,000, a staggering figure for a medieval army, especially one assembled without noble patronage or royal treasury. They gathered first at Cologne, a swelling tide of humanity that strained the city's resources and patience. The citizens initially welcomed them as holy warriors, but soon grew alarmed at their numbers and the disorder that followed in their wake. The departure from Cologne revealed the first signs of trouble. Without proper supply chains or financial reserves, the people's armies immediately faced the problem of feeding themselves. Some brought what provisions they could carry. Others trusted entirely in divine provision. Hadn't Christ multiplied the loaves and fishes? Wouldn't he do the same for those marching to liberate his tomb? Still others simply took what they needed from the countryside they passed through, believing that their holy mission justified any means of sustenance. As they moved eastward through the Rhineland, the first tragedy of the Crusades unfolded. In cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, local Jewish communities became targets of violence. The connection was made with terrible simplicity. If they were marching to fight the enemies of Christ in distant lands, why tolerate the killers of Christ at home? The papal call had made no mention of attacking Jews. Indeed, church doctrine explicitly protected Jews as witnesses to the Old Covenant. But popular preachers who had attached themselves to Peter's following had fewer theological scruples. "Before we cleanse Jerusalem of the infidel, let us cleanse our own lands," one such preacher reportedly declared in the marketplace at Worms. The mob that gathered around him needed little encouragement. They fell upon the Jewish quarter with swords, clubs, and firebrands. The violence was horrific. Entire communities were given the choice between baptism and death, a grotesque perversion of genuine conversion. Many chose death rather than abandon their ancient faith. In Mainz, some Jews took their own lives and those of their families rather than face the mob or forced conversion. The Archbishop's palace, where many had sought sanctuary, was stormed despite the prelate's attempts to protect his Jewish charges. These massacres represent the darkest shadow of religious fervor, untempered by discipline or true Christian charity. Peter himself seems not to have encouraged the violence, but neither did he effectively condemn or prevent it. The People's Crusade had already escaped whatever moral constraints its initiators might have imagined. As the unwieldy mass of humanity moved into Hungary, new problems emerged. King Coloman had initially granted permission for the Crusaders to cross his lands, provided they traveled peacefully and paid for what they consumed. For a while this arrangement held, but at the fortress town of Zemun, misunderstandings and provocations led to open conflict. The Crusaders, believing they had been cheated in the markets, stormed the city, killing thousands and looting indiscriminately. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who received increasingly alarming reports of the approaching horde, now faced a serious dilemma. He had requested Western military aid against the Seljuk Turks, but this undisciplined mob offered more danger than assistance. Nevertheless, he arranged for guides to meet Peter's followers at the Byzantine border and escort them safely to Constantinople, hoping to move them through his territories with minimal damage. Constantinople was a shock to the Western travelers. Many had never seen a city of any size. Now they beheld the greatest metropolis of the Christian world, with its massive walls, countless churches crowned by the incomparable Hagia Sophia, palaces, and bustling markets filled with goods from as far away as China. For people who had lived in wooden structures all their lives, the stone and marble splendor of the Byzantine capital seemed almost heavenly. Emperor Alexios, wise in the ways of politics, if not always in his assessment of Western intentions, treated Peter with cautious respect while making it clear that his followers should proceed quickly across the Bosporus into Asia Minor. The emperor had no desire to see his carefully manicured capital overrun or his complex diplomatic relationships with neighboring Muslim powers disrupted by premature aggression. Wait for the main crusading armies, Alexios advised Peter. Alone, you cannot hope to succeed against the Turks, but waiting was impossible for a force held together only by momentum and religious enthusiasm. Within days of crossing into Asia Minor in early August 1096, despite imperial warnings, separate contingents began conducting raids against local Turkish settlements. At Sivato, Kibotos, they established a crude camp and launched increasingly ambitious raiding expeditions. Initial success against unprepared Turkish outposts fueled overconfidence. They ventured farther, took greater risks, ignored the most basic principles of reconnaissance and security. The Seljuk Sultan of Rum, Kilij Arslan, initially dismissed these raids as mere nuisance. But as they continued and expanded, he recognized the need for a decisive response. Gathering his forces, he set a trap that the inexperienced crusaders walked into with almost childlike innocence. On October 21st, a substantial crusader force was ambushed near Nicaea, surrounded by Turkish mounted archers who maintained their distance while pouring arrows into the densely packed European foot soldiers. The People's Crusade experienced warfare unlike anything in their Western experience. There was no honorable, close combat, no opportunity to bring their superior physical strength to bear. Just the whisper of arrows, the screams of the wounded, and the growing realization that they were utterly outmatched. Few survived the battlefield. Those who fled back towards Civito found the camp itself under attack. Men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. A handful escaped to a nearby abandoned fortress, where they held out until Byzantine ships rescued them, returning the battered remnants to Constantinople. Peter himself had been in Constantinople during the disaster, perhaps seeking supplies or negotiating with imperial officials. He survived to join the later, more organized crusading armies. But his grand vision, the liberation of Jerusalem by the power of faith alone, by the humble rather than the mighty, had ended in blood and disillusionment. The People's Crusade, first to depart and first to discover the harsh realities awaiting in the East, becomes a ghostly presence haunting the later, more successful crusading efforts. Their bones, scattered across the plains of Anatolia, stand as mute testimony to the gap between religious enthusiasm and military reality, between apocalyptic expectation and historical circumstance. Yet in their failure lies a kind of terrible triumph, the demonstration of faith so complete that thousands would leave everything familiar behind to march toward almost certain death in distant lands. Their devotion was real, their courage undeniable, even as their understanding proved fatally limited. The noble-led armies that would soon follow would learn tactical lessons from the People's Crusade disaster. They would move with greater caution, maintain better discipline, respect the fighting capabilities of their Turkish opponents. But whether they would preserve anything of the pure, if naive, spiritual commitment that drove Peter's followers remains an open question as the First Crusade proper begins its long march eastward. Noble knights in gleaming mail depart with banners snapping in the breeze, a vision of martial Christianity that will define the Western imagination for centuries to come. The reality, as always, is more complicated. The armor is often inherited, patched from previous conflicts. The horses grow thinner with each passing mile. The landscapes through which they pass offer beauty and terror in equal measure. Distance changes people, sometimes revealing their true character, sometimes transforming them into someone they themselves would not recognize. Unlike the chaotic exodus of the People's Crusade, the main crusading armies depart with greater organization and clearer leadership. Not as a single force, but as separate contingents following different routes toward a common destination. Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios waits with wariness, born from his experience with Peter's followers. 4 main armies take shape in the late summer of 1096, each centered around powerful nobles and their vassals. From northern France and Flanders come the forces of Robert of Normandy, brother of the English king, Robert of Flanders, and Stephen of Blois. These northerners travel south through Italy, wintering in the Norman territories of southern Italy before crossing to Byzantine lands in the spring. From the Rhineland and Lotharingia comes Godfrey of Bouillon, with his brothers Baldwin and Eustace leading a predominantly German contingent. They follow the overland route through Hungary, having learned from the People's Crusade's mistakes to maintain better discipline. From Provence and southern France, Count Raymond of Toulouse leads the largest single army, traveling along the Dalmatian coast before turning inland toward Constantinople. Raymond, older than the other leaders and deeply pious, brings with him the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy, granting his contingent a degree of spiritual authority. From southern Italy, The Norman adventurer Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred crossed the Adriatic with a smaller but highly professional force, composed largely of veterans from the Norman conquest of Sicily and their ongoing conflicts with Byzantium. The journey itself becomes a crucible. Summer heat gives way to autumn rains, turning roads to mud that sucks at horses' hooves and men's boots. Rivers must be crossed, sometimes by existing bridges, sometimes by hastily constructed pontoons. Mountain passes test endurance, with thin, air-making armor feel twice as heavy, and narrow defiles creating perfect conditions for ambush. Winter brings new challenges: freezing temperatures, snow-clogged passes, the constant battle against dampness that rusts metal and rots leather. Food becomes an endless preoccupation. The armies are too large to live off the land without organization. Arrangements must be made with local rulers, markets established, hunting parties sent out. The Byzantine emperor sends instructions to his provincial governors, ordering them to prepare supplies along the projected route, though often the reality falls short of the promise, creating tensions that will later have significant consequences. Disease travels with them, as it always does with medieval armies. Dysentery from contaminated water, respiratory infections that spread rapidly through crowded camps, infected wounds that turn gangrenous in the absence of effective treatment. The priests who accompany the armies stay busy administering last rites, hearing final confessions, offering what comfort they can to the dying, who are buried in unmarked graves along the route, their crusades ending anonymously hundreds of miles from Jerusalem. Yet there are moments of wonder too. For many of these warriors, this journey represents their first exposure to worlds beyond their native provinces. They marvel at the sophisticated cities of Byzantine territories, at strange foods and customs, at Eastern Christian rituals so different from their Latin practices. Some respond with open curiosity, others with suspicion that hardens into prejudice. The cultural gap between Eastern and Western Christianity, already widening due to theological and political disputes, grows more apparent with each passing day. The reception varies as they pass through different lands. In Hungary, King Koloman, remembering the People's Crusades' destructive passage, insists on hostages and strict discipline from Godfrey's forces. The Byzantine governors in the Balkans, following imperial orders, provide markets but keep city gates closed, allowing only small groups of crusaders to enter at any time. Local populations sometimes welcome the crusaders as fellow Christians and defenders of the faith. Other times, they hide their valuables and retreat to walled towns, having heard stories of pillaging and violence. By early 1097, the separate armies begin to arrive outside Constantinople, the magnificent city with its triple walls and golden domes, its palaces and churches and bustling markets, overwhelms even the most worldly crusader. Nothing in Western Europe compares to this preservation of Roman imperial splendor. Yet rather than humility, the sight often provokes envy and resentment. If these Greeks possess such wealth, why have they not liberated Jerusalem themselves? Why do they need Western help at all? Emperor Alexios views the arriving armies with complex emotions. He had requested military assistance against the Turks, who had seized much of Anatolia after the Byzantine defeat at Manzikert in 1071. What has arrived is something else entirely, a massive, independent military force with its own objectives, only partially aligned with Byzantine interests. The emperor is a skilled diplomat, experienced in managing barbarian allies and enemies alike. He will need all his cunning to channel this Western energy in directions beneficial to his empire. The decisive issue becomes the oath of fealty. Alexios insists that each crusade leader swear an oath promising to return to the empire any formerly Byzantine territories they might conquer. Some, like Godfrey, resist initially, but eventually all comply, though with varying degrees of sincerity. Bohemond, who had previously fought against Alexios in the Balkans, takes the oath with particular smoothness. already perhaps calculating how it might be circumvented later. In return for these oaths, Alexios provides guides, interpreters, additional supplies, and Byzantine military contingents to accompany the Crusaders into Anatolia. He also arranges for them to be ferried across the Bosporus with remarkable efficiency, eager to have such dangerous allies outside his capital. By spring 1097, the combined Crusader forces have crossed into Asia Minor and begin the march toward their first major objective, the Seljuk capital of Nicaea. The armies that advance are no longer the same as those that left Western Europe. They have been tempered by the journey, winnowed by hardship and disease, transformed by exposure to new lands and peoples. Some have grown more fervent in their religious commitment, seeing divine providence in their survival of winter storms or mountain passes. Others have become more cynical, witnessing how quickly high principles can erode when faced with hunger or fear. The bonds between men who march together, who share food and water, who stand watch through long cold nights, have strengthened. Regional differences, Norman, Flemish, Provençal, Lotharingian, remain important, but a new identity is slowly forming. They are Franks to the Eastern Christians and Muslims alike, regardless of their specific origins. And increasingly, they see themselves as a unit with a shared purpose, despite the ongoing rivalries between their leaders. As they march deeper into Anatolia, the landscape changes. Fertile coastal plains give way to drier, more rugged terrain. Byzantine villages with their stone churches and ancient olive groves become scarcer. Signs of Turkish presence increase. Abandoned outposts, distant riders watching from hillsides, occasional skirmishes with scouting parties. The Crusaders have entered contested territory, where their vague notions of fighting the infidel will soon crystallize into specific tactical challenges. The lessons of the People's Crusade have been partially learned. Scouts range ahead of the main forces. Marching formation is maintained with greater discipline. Knights understand they must adapt their fighting styles to counter the Turkish horse archers' mobility and ranged attacks. Yet overconfidence remains a constant temptation, especially among warriors raised on tales of individual heroism and the certainty of divine favor. What none of these men yet comprehend is how thoroughly this journey will transform them. Those who survive to reach Jerusalem, less than half of those who departed, will be changed in ways they cannot anticipate. The distance between their homes and their destination is measured not just in miles, but in experiences that will render some of them unrecognizable to the families they left behind. The road stretches before them, dusty and uncertain. Nicaea awaits, and beyond it challenges none have yet imagined. They march on, armor growing heavier, water supplies lower, faith tested with each footsore mile. Jerusalem exists still primarily in their imagination, a golden city bathed in divine light. The reality, should they live to see it, will be both less and more than this dream that pulls them eastward through alien lands. Exhaustion has its own gravity. It pulls at mail-clad shoulders, drags at mud-caked boots, weighs on eyelids, struggling to stay open during night watches. After months of marching, fighting, and privation, the Crusader armies that arrive before the walls of Antioch in October 1097 carry their weariness like an additional burden. Yet here they must find the strength for their greatest challenge yet, a siege that will test not just their military skill, but their very commitment to the crusading ideal. Antioch is no ordinary city. Founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals and later a major center of early Christianity, indeed, the place where the term Christian was first used, it has fallen to the Seljuk Turks only 14 years earlier. Its massive walls, reinforced by 400 towers, enclose an area larger than any Western European city of the era. The Orontes River protects its western flank, while steep mountains shield its eastern side. Only the northern and southern approaches offer possibilities for assault, and these are heavily fortified. Inside the city, The Turkish governor Yagisian commands a substantial garrison. Though technically a vassal of the Seljuk Sultan Kerboga of Mosul, he effectively rules Antioch as his personal domain. He is prepared for the Crusaders' arrival by expelling many of the city's Christian residents, though some remain, living under suspicion, stockpiling provisions, and strengthening defenses. The Crusader camp takes shape on the northern and eastern sides of Antioch, a sprawling, disorganized settlement of tents, makeshift shelters, and open cookfires. The separate contingents maintain their distinct identities and leadership, though overall strategy is discussed in councils of the principal commanders. Bohemond of Taranto, with his experience in siege warfare from campaigns in Sicily, emerges as an increasingly influential voice in these discussions. Initially, supplies are adequate. The surrounding valley is fertile, its orchards and farms providing food for the besiegers. Local Christian communities, particularly Armenian and Syrian Christians, who have little love for their Turkish overlords, offer assistance. Ships from Italian maritime cities arrive at the port of St. Simeon, bringing additional provisions and siege equipment. But Antioch cannot be starved into submission quickly. Its storehouses are too well stocked, its walls too strong for direct assault with the resources available. As weeks stretch into months, the Crusaders find themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Winter rains transform their camp into a muddy morass. Diseases spread through crowded quarters. Food supplies dwindle as the surrounding countryside is stripped bare. "We left our homes to save the Holy Sepulchre," one knight is reported to have said, "only to dig our own graves outside Antioch." Foraging parties range farther from camp, risking Turkish ambush to find food. Discipline begins to fray. Some knights, including Peter the Hermit himself and various nobles who should have known better, attempt to desert, slipping away in the night toward the coast. They are caught and forced to swear humiliating oaths to remain, but their example damages morale. Inside the city, conditions are little better, though better provisioned initially. The defenders also feel the strain of the prolonged siege. Food supplies diminish. The expelled Christians, camped miserably outside the walls or taken in by the Crusaders, provide intelligence about weaknesses in the defenses and the declining situation within. The siege becomes a test of endurance and will. Turkish relief forces make occasional sorties against the Crusader camp, preventing total encirclement of the city. The besiegers construct crude fortifications of their own, a castle aptly named Malregard, Evil View, overlooking the city, and later a bridge of boats across the Orontes to intercept Turkish sorties from the western gates. By December, famine grips the Crusader camp. Soldiers eat their horses, then dogs, then rodents, and the leather of their shoes. The winter rains are relentless, soaking through tents, rusting armor, turning the ground to a sucking quagmire that offers no respite even in sleep. Cases of desertion increase. Even some of the leaders begin to question whether God truly wills their success, whether the entire enterprise might be abandoned without shame. Yet when Byzantine advisors suggest a temporary retreat to the coast, until better weather and supplies can be arranged, the Crusade leaders refuse. They have come too far, sacrificed too much. To retreat now would be to admit defeat, not just militarily, but spiritually. The very identity they have forged through hardship would dissolve. In this darkest moment, religion provides renewed purpose. On January 13th, 1098, as a meteor shower illuminates the night sky, a priest named Peter Desiderius reports a vision of Christ, who promises victory if the Crusaders purify themselves of sin. A 3-day fast is proclaimed. Barefoot processions circle the camp, with clergy bearing relics and leading prayers. Sexual relations are forbidden, gambling and drinking curtailed. The army attempts to remake itself as a truly holy force, worthy of divine assistance. Whether through renewed spiritual purpose or simple desperation, the siege finds new momentum. An English engineer named Odo constructs more sophisticated siege machines. Turkish messages, intercepted by Armenian Christians, reveal growing discord among the various Muslim powers that might send relief to Antioch. Small victories, the capture of a bridge, the repulse of a sortie, are celebrated as signs of divine favor. The decisive breakthrough comes not through military might, but human fallibility. Bohemond establishes contact with an Armenian guard, commander inside Antioch named Firuz, who is converted to Islam but harbors resentments against Yagisian, whether motivated by bribery, promises of protection for his family, or genuine sympathy for the Christian cause. Firuz agrees to allow Crusaders to enter through his tower under cover of darkness. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, with most of the Crusader army creating a diversion at the opposite end of the city, Bohemond leads a small force to Firuz's tower. Scaling ladders are raised. About 60 men climb anxiously, knowing that discovery would mean certain death. The first Crusaders over the wall secure the tower, killing the unsuspecting guards. More follow. By dawn, several towers are in Crusader hands, and the main gates are opened from within. What follows is the dark mirror of holy war, a mass slaughter that spares neither combatants nor civilians. Pent-up hunger, fear, and religious hatred find expression in indiscriminate violence. Muslim residents are killed regardless of age or gender. Some Christians and Jews die as well, unable to prove their identity quickly enough in the chaos. Yagisian attempts to flee, but falls from his horse outside the city. His abandoned head is later brought to the Crusader leaders. By nightfall, Antioch's streets run with blood, its buildings burn, and the victorious Crusaders indulge in the desperate excesses of men who have lived too long with death as their constant companion. The triumph proves short-lived. Within days, the massive army of Kaboga of Mosul arrives outside Antioch, trapping the Crusaders within the city they have just taken. The besiegers become the besieged, now with depleted provisions and exhausted bodies. The massive stores, expected to be found in Antioch, have been exaggerated. There is little food to sustain the army through another prolonged engagement. Desertion resumes. Some slip over the walls at night, making for the coast, earning the contemptuous nickname rope dancers from those who remain. Among those who escape is Stephen of Blois, who encounters a Byzantine relief force led by Emperor Alexios himself and convinces them that the crusade is doomed, leading to the emperor's withdrawal and deepening the sense of abandonment among those remaining in Antioch. In this second moment of crisis, another religious event reshapes the narrative. A poor Provençal pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew reports a series of visions in which St. Andrew has revealed to him the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, hidden beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral. Count Raymond of Toulouse, always the most religiously motivated of the leaders, supports an excavation. After a day of increasingly desperate digging, Peter himself jumps into the hole and miraculously discovers an iron rod that he proclaims to be the Holy Lance. Despite skepticism from some, particularly the Norman and Italian contingents, who note that Constantinople already claims to possess the true lance, the discovery galvanizes the army. Whether through genuine religious fervor or the psychology of shared delusion born of extreme stress, the Crusaders find new resolve. A council decides on a bold gamble. Rather than slowly starve inside Antioch, they will march out and confront Kaboga's numerically superior force directly. After 3 days of fasting and religious ceremonies, on June 28, 1098, the Crusader army, now reduced to perhaps 20,000 fighting men from the much larger force that began the siege, emerges from Antioch's gates in battle formation, the newly discovered Holy Lance carried before them as a talisman. The battle that follows seems to confirm divine intervention. Despite their weakened condition and inferior numbers, the Crusaders achieve a stunning victory. Kaboga's coalition army, composed of contingents from different Muslim states with their own agendas and rivalries, disintegrates under the focused assault. By nightfall, the Turkish camp has been captured intact, providing the desperate Crusaders with badly needed supplies, weapons, and animals. Antioch is secured, but at terrible cost. The Crusader army that finally resumes its march toward Jerusalem in January 1099 is greatly diminished from the force that began the siege 14 months earlier. Disease, starvation, combat, and desertion have taken their toll. The survivors are hardened, their faith either deepened by apparent divine validation or transformed into a more pragmatic commitment to their companions and the shared journey. The siege of Antioch marks the crucible of the First Crusade, the point where abstract ideals confronted harsh reality, where faith was tested against hunger, where noble intentions dissolved and reformed under extreme pressure. Those who emerged from this trial were no longer the same men who had taken the cross 2 years earlier in Europe. They had become something new, not always something better or more virtuous, but unquestionably transformed by what they had endured together. Sacred. Destinations seldom match our dreams of them. The golden Jerusalem that existed in Crusader imaginations, streets perhaps literally paved with gold, heavenly light bathing holy sites, a city suspended between heaven and earth, bears little resemblance to the dusty, war-weary settlement they will actually find. The tension between the Jerusalem of faith and the Jerusalem of stone creates the final psychological drama of the First Crusade. The army that finally resumes its southward march in January 1099 is severely reduced from the massive force that departed Europe. Perhaps 12,000 fighting men remain, along with unknown numbers of clergy, pilgrims, and camp followers. They have left behind substantial garrisons in conquered territories. Bohemond remains in Antioch, claiming it as his prize despite his oath to Emperor Alexios. Baldwin has established himself in Edessa to the northeast, creating the first formal Crusader state. The route from Antioch to Jerusalem takes them along the Mediterranean coast, a more hospitable path than the dangerous inland roads through Muslim-controlled territories. The coastal cities, many still under nominal Byzantine control, or held by local Christian populations, provide supplies and support. Some surrender without resistance when the Crusader army appears. Others require brief sieges or negotiations. The journey has a different character now. Nearly 3 years have passed since these men left their homes. They have survived winter mountain crossings, Turkish arrows, starvation outside Antioch, disease, and the temptation to abandon their quest. Those who remain share a bond forged through extreme hardship, a collective identity stronger than their original regional and linguistic differences. They also share a single-minded focus on the final objective that allows them to overcome obstacles that might earlier have seemed insurmountable. In May 1099, at the town of Arca near Tripoli, a theological controversy briefly divides the army. Peter Bartholomew, the visionary who discovered the Holy Lance at Antioch, has continued to report divine revelations that conveniently align with Count Raymond's political objectives. Skepticism about these visions, long simmering among the Norman and Italian contingents, finally erupts into open challenge. Peter volunteers to undergo an ordeal by fire to prove his vision's authenticity. A lane is formed between two burning piles of olive branches. Peter, carrying the supposed Holy Lance, runs between them. He emerges alive but badly burned and dies in agony 12 days later. For some, this confirms his fraud. For others, the fact that he survived the flames at all suggests divine protection. The lance continues to be carried with the army, but its symbolic power is diminished, a casualty of factionalism and growing pragmatism among men who have seen too many miracles that proved illusory. As they move southward into Palestine proper, the landscape changes. the relatively fertile coast gives way to more arid terrain. June brings scorching heat. Water sources become crucial strategic objectives. The army marches in early morning and late afternoon, seeking shelter during the most punishing midday hours. Men collapse from heat exhaustion. Horses and pack animals die, their bodies left to scavengers along the route. Yet still, they press on, driven by the knowledge that Jerusalem is now mere days away. Rumors reach them of an Egyptian Fatimid army marching northward to intercept them. The Fatimids, Shiite Muslims who controlled Jerusalem until the Seljuk Turks captured it in 1073, had recently recaptured the city from their Sunni rivals. The Crusaders now face an opponent who has had time to prepare defenses and gather supplies. The window for assault before Egyptian reinforcements arrive is narrow and closing. On June 7, 1099, the vanguard crests a ridge and catches their first glimpse of Jerusalem. The moment is recorded by several chroniclers, most famously by Raymond of Aguilera. When the men saw the city, they were filled with joy and wonder. They raised their hands to heaven, giving thanks to God who had granted them to see what they had so ardently desired. Many fall to their knees. Some kiss the ground, others weep openly. Armed knights, who have endured unimaginable hardships without complaint, now sob like children at the sight of the holy city's walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. For a brief, transcendent moment, the Jerusalem of faith and the Jerusalem of stone become one reality. This emotional pinnacle quickly gives way to tactical assessment. Jerusalem's walls, rebuilt by the Fatimids in anticipation of the Crusaders' arrival, are formidable. The city is well provisioned and garrisoned with professional Egyptian troops. The surrounding landscape has been stripped of timber needed for siege engines, and wells and cisterns outside the walls have been poisoned or filled in. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, has expelled most of the Christian population, removing potential fifth column support from within. The Crusaders establish camps on the northern and western sides of Jerusalem, where the terrain is more favorable for assault. Count Raymond positions his Provençal forces on Mount Zion to the south. Initial probing attacks reveal the strength of the defenses and the inadequacy of the Crusaders' remaining siege equipment. A frontal assault without proper preparation would be suicidal. As the siege settles into a familiar pattern of skirmishes and resource competition, the religious dimension reasserts itself. Jerusalem is not merely another strategic objective, but the very purpose of the entire crusade. Its capture must be not only militarily successful, but spiritually meaningful. The army's religious leaders organize processions around the city walls, consciously evoking the biblical story of Joshua and the fall of Jericho. On July 8, 1099, a priest named Peter Desiderius reports a vision from the deceased Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate who had died at Antioch. The vision instructs the Crusaders to fast and process barefoot around Jerusalem as penitence before making their final attack. 5 days later, the whole army, knights and foot soldiers alike, removes their shoes and circles the city in a solemn procession, ending at the Mount of Olives, where they are addressed by religious leaders. This ritual serves multiple purposes. It unifies the army in shared religious purpose, temporarily transcending the rivalries that have threatened to fracture the crusade. It provides a psychological reset, allowing these battle-hardened men to reconnect with the spiritual motivations that began their journey. And it offers divine sanction for the violence they are about to unleash, violence that will be extreme even by the standards of medieval warfare. The contrast could not be more stark. Men who circle the city in humble penitence one day return to their siege works with renewed determination to breach its walls the next. The same hands that are raised in prayer will soon wield weapons in slaughter. This duality, the pilgrim and the warrior combined in the same person, embodies the fundamental contradiction of the crusading ideal. Jerusalem waits behind its ancient walls, having witnessed countless conquests and reconquests throughout. its history. Canaanites, Israelites, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Turks, all have claimed it, all have eventually lost it. The stones themselves seem to whisper a warning about the impermanence of victory that the Crusaders, in their moment of imminent triumph, cannot or will not hear. Within the city, Jewish, Muslim, and remaining Christian residents prepare for the assault, each in their own way. Some pray for deliverance, others hide valuables or plan escape routes. Still others take up positions on the walls, determined to defend their homes against the foreign invaders who claim divine mandate for their conquest. All sense that something momentous approaches. Not just another change of rulers, but a collision of worlds and faiths that will leave no one untouched. The final assault is days away. The Crusaders gather materials, build siege towers, position catapults. They look toward the walls with anticipation that mixes bloodlust and devotion in proportions that vary from man to man, but exist in some measure in all. Jerusalem has been the object of their dreams for 3 years of hardship. Now it stands, before them, tantalizingly close yet still beyond reach. A physical city that must somehow fulfill the spiritual promises that have sustained them on their incredible journey. Dawn breaks over ancient walls, painting them briefly in soft gold before the harsh reality of Palestinian summer reasserts itself. It is July 15th, 1099, and the Crusaders have been besieging Jerusalem for just over a month. Today will decide everything. Either they will breach the walls and fulfill their vows, or they will fail before an Egyptian relief army can arrive from the south. The siege has been one of frantic preparation. 2 massive wooden towers have been constructed, one under Godfrey of Bouillon's direction on the northern side, the other under Count Raymond's supervision to the south. Building these towers required stripping the surrounding countryside of every available piece of timber, dismantling buildings in nearby Bethlehem, and even breaking up ships brought overland from Jaffa. Each tower holds multiple levels of soldiers. Crossbowmen on the upper platforms to clear the walls of defenders, infantry in the middle sections ready to deploy a drawbridge onto the ramparts, sappers and engineers below to maneuver the unwieldy structures against the walls. Inside Jerusalem, the Fatimid governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla has observed these preparations with growing concern. His garrison of perhaps 1,000 professional soldiers, supplemented by civilian militia, has successfully repelled initial assaults and inflicted significant casualties on the Crusaders. But the towers represent a graver threat. His own counter-preparations include strengthening the walls with sandbags and timber at likely points of attack, positioning his limited supply of Greek fire, an early form of flamethrower, to target the wooden structures, and distributing his forces to cover the areas of greatest vulnerability. The dawn light catches on metal as soldiers make final adjustments to their armor. Prayers whisper through the Crusader camps, some asking for victory, others for forgiveness, in advance of what is to come. The wooden towers creak as they begin their slow, ponderous journey toward Jerusalem's walls. The defenders respond immediately. Arrows rain down, some aflame, seeking to ignite the tower's wooden frames. Greek fire, that mysterious Byzantine concoction that burns even on water, spurts from primitive flamethrowers, causing momentary panic among the Crusaders. But the towers have been covered with wet animal hides, dampening the effectiveness of these incendiary attacks. Heat rises from the stone as the morning progresses. In the towers, men breathe shallowly, tasting dust and sweat. The structure under Godfrey's command approaches the northeastern section of the wall near what is now called Herod's Gate. Raymond's tower moves with painful slowness toward the walls, facing Mount Zion. Throughout the day, the towers inch closer. Casualties mount on both sides. Defenders struck by crossbow bolts, attackers crushed when portions of their siege equipment collapse. The landscape is transformed into a theatre of suffering, where time stretches like pulled wool. By mid-afternoon, Godfrey's tower makes contact with the wall. The drawbridge crashes down. For a moment, there is perfect stillness. Then a Flemish knight named Letold of Tournai becomes the first crusader to step onto Jerusalem's ramparts. Behind him flows a tide of armoured men, screaming, "Deus vult!" as they pour onto the walls. The defences crumble quickly after the breach. Muslim defenders retreat toward the Temple Mount and the Tower of David. Civilian residents, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, flee to their homes, barricading doors against what they know is coming. What follows is what chronicles call the purification of the Holy City, but what history remembers as the Massacre of Jerusalem. Streets that had echoed with calls to prayer now echo with screams. Blood runs between cobblestones that have witnessed millennia of human drama. The Crusaders, believing themselves instruments of divine will, show little mercy. Some chronicles claim the blood reached their ankles, their knees. Such accounts are surely exaggerated, yet speak to the emotional truth of the day. By evening, the only sounds are the moans of the wounded and the prayers of the victors. Some crusaders, their bloodlust spent, wander in shock through blood-spattered streets. Others make their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believed to contain Christ's tomb, where they lay down their weapons and weep. Barefoot and bloodied, Godfrey of Bouillon enters the church and kneels in prayer. Raymond of Toulouse arrives late to this scene of devotion. His tower had been less successful, and he entered through a gate opened from within. Finding the city, already taken, he feels both relief and disappointment. The complex emotions of arriving after the decisive moment has passed. Night falls on a Jerusalem transformed. Smoke rises from burning buildings. The dead remain where they fell. And in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, victorious knights keep vigil, whispering prayers of thanksgiving, while distant screams occasionally pierce the holy quiet. For many Crusaders, this moment represents the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. They have fulfilled their vows. They have reclaimed Christianity's holiest site. Some will return home to Europe, bearing palm fronds as proof of pilgrimage. Others will remain to build a new kingdom. But tonight, as stars appear above the ancient city, what they have created remains uncertain. Victory carries with it the seeds of its own undoing. The blood spilled this day will call for response. The city has been taken, but holding it will prove a different challenge entirely. Jerusalem sleeps uneasily, as it has through so many conquests before. The stones absorb another layer of history. The dust settles on another chapter. And beneath it all, the quiet certainty that this too shall pass. There is a strange irony in conquest. The desire to possess often transforms into the burden of responsibility. As dawn breaks over Jerusalem in the days following its capture, this reality settles upon the victorious Crusaders like morning dew. The kingdom they establish exists as a paradox, a European society transplanted into Levantine soil. A Latin, Christian realm surrounded by Islamic powers. A feudal system imposed upon ancient trading routes and agricultural practices that have sustained this land for centuries. You might imagine the first morning after the conquest. The streets still bear dark stains. Bodies have been removed. Muslim and Jewish dead taken outside the walls for mass burial. Christian casualties given proper rites. Godfrey of Bouillon, reluctant to take a king's title in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns, accepts the position of advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. He walks these quieted streets, seeing his reflection in pools of water, wondering perhaps if he recognizes the man looking back. The practical concerns of governance come quickly. Only a small fraction of the Crusaders will remain. Perhaps 300 knights and a few thousand infantry settle in the newly conquered territories. Most pilgrims, having fulfilled their vows, prepare for the long journey home. bearing palm fronds and water from the Jordan River as proof of pilgrimage. Those who stay face immediate challenges. The local population has been decimated, yet agriculture must continue. Water systems must be maintained, markets must reopen, governance structures must be established. The Crusaders, mostly warriors with little administrative experience, adapt medieval European customs to this unfamiliar environment. The Kingdom of Jerusalem emerges as the central Crusader state, stretching along the Mediterranean coast from Beirut to the Sinai Peninsula. Around it, supporting states take shape: the county of Edessa to the north, the Principality of Antioch along the Syrian coast, and the county of Tripoli between Antioch and Jerusalem. Together, they form what historians call Outremer, the land beyond the sea. Life in these Crusader states develops its own rhythm and character. Stonemasons from Europe collaborate with local craftsmen, creating a distinctive architectural style that blends Romanesque traditions with Byzantine and Islamic influences. Knights adapt their heavy armor and fighting techniques to accommodate the punishing Middle Eastern heat. European crops are planted alongside local varieties of wheat, olives, and fruits. In the narrow streets of Jerusalem, Armenian merchants haggle with Italian traders over spices brought from India. Frankish knights develop a taste for sugarcane, previously unknown in Europe. Fabrics of silk and cotton replace the heavier woolens of their homeland. Slowly, the conquerors are themselves conquered by the subtle influences of climate, cuisine, and culture. The legal system that emerges reflects this complexity. The Assizes of Jerusalem, the legal code of the kingdom, incorporates elements of European feudal law alongside provisions that acknowledge the reality of governing a multi-religious, multi-ethnic population. Muslims and Jews are permitted to practice their faiths, though under restrictions. Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syrian, Coptic, Armenian, maintain their churches and communities, though relegated to secondary status beneath their Latin rulers. This is not equality as we might understand it, but rather a pragmatic accommodation. The Frankish rulers simply lack the numbers to completely replace existing social structures. Instead, they position themselves as a ruling elite atop a complex social hierarchy. In the countryside surrounding Jerusalem, you might see a Frankish knight riding past fields where local peasants continue agricultural practices unchanged for centuries. His armor gleams in the sun. His horse's hooves kick up dust that settles on olive trees that have stood since before the time of Christ. He passes a caravan of camels laden with goods bound for Damascus, nodding to the Muslim merchant who leads it, a man with whom he might trade, though never fully trust. The most visible manifestations of Crusader rule are architectural. Massive castles rise on strategic hilltops. Crac des Chevaliers, Beaufort, Montreal. Their thick walls and concentric defenses designed to be held by small garrisons against larger forces. Churches are built or rebuilt, none more significant than the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself, reconstructed in the Romanesque style over Byzantine foundations. These stone testimonies speak to the Crusaders' intent to remain permanently. Yet there is an anxiety that whispers beneath daily life. Awareness of being outnumbered, of being foreign, of holding lands surrounded by powers that view them as intruders. Military orders emerge to address this precarious position. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to care for sick pilgrims, evolve into a fighting force. The Knights Templar form to protect travelers on the dangerous roads between coastal ports and Jerusalem. These warrior monks, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while training in the arts of war, become the backbone of Crusader military power. Trade flourishes despite these tensions. Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, establish commercial quarters in coastal cities like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa. Their ships carry pilgrims and crusaders eastward, returning to Europe laden with silk, sugar, glass, and spices. These commercial networks enrich both the Crusader states and their European trading partners, creating economic interdependencies that sometimes transcend religious and cultural divisions. Courts in Outremer develop their own character. Queen Melisenda, daughter of Baldwin II, and an Armenian noblewoman, rules as regent and then co-ruler with her son Baldwin III, patronizing art and architecture while navigating the kingdom's complex politics. Under her influence, the court develops a cosmopolitan character, still European in its fundamental orientation, yet influenced by Byzantine ceremony and Islamic artistic motifs. As the decades pass, some families become increasingly rooted in this Levantine world. Children born in Outremer, called poulains by newly arrived Europeans, speak Arabic alongside French, dress in lighter fabrics suited to the climate, and develop tastes for local foods and customs. They understand the local population in ways their parents could not, sometimes developing relationships that cross religious boundaries. Yet this cultural hybridization remains superficial in many ways. The Frankish elite never fully integrate with the local population. They remain a minority, dependent on constant reinforcement from Europe, new crusaders, new pilgrims, new settlers, to maintain their position. This demographic reality creates an underlying fragility that will ultimately prove fatal. For now, though, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stands, improbable, yet real. Its very existence represents both the fulfillment of Pope Urban's vision and a departure from it. Created by religious fervor, it survives through pragmatic accommodation. Founded on military conquest, it endures through complex networks of trade and diplomacy. As the sun sets over Jerusalem, casting long shadows from the Tower of David across stones worn smooth by countless footsteps, the kingdom exists in borrowed, time on borrowed land. Its stones whisper secrets to those who listen, of faith transformed into governance, of pilgrimage become settlement, of crusade become kingdom. Patience cultivates strength like water-shaped stone, not through sudden force but through persistent presence. In the decades following the First Crusade, as the Crusader states established their precarious existence, a response was taking shape within the Islamic world. Not immediate, not unified at first, but gathering like clouds before a storm. The initial Muslim reaction to the Crusader conquests had been fragmented. Political divisions between the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, the Seljuk Turks of Anatolia and Syria, and various independent emirates had prevented a coordinated response. Local rulers sometimes found it more expedient to negotiate with the Frankish newcomers than to unite with rival Muslim powers against them. But beneath these political calculations, a deeper current was stirring. Islamic scholars and religious leaders began to reframe the conflict, calling for unity in the face of foreign invasion. The concept of jihad, spiritual struggle that could include armed defense of the faith, gained renewed emphasis in sermons and writings. The recovery of Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina, became an increasingly powerful rallying cry. Into this historical moment stepped a figure whose name would become synonymous with the Muslim counter-crusade, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Western world as Saladin, born in Tikrit, in modern Iraq, to a Kurdish family in the service of Turkish rulers. Saladin's early life gave little indication of his future role. He studied the Quran, poetry, and astronomy. He learned horsemanship and statecraft. He observed the complex politics of a region where power shifted like desert sands. These experiences shaped him into something rare. A leader with both martial skill and spiritual depth, political acumen and personal austerity. His rise to power came gradually. Serving his uncle Shirkuh on military campaigns in Egypt, he demonstrated both courage and wisdom. When Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin succeeded, him as vizier to the Fatimid Caliph. 2 years later, upon the caliph's death, he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate entirely, bringing Egypt back under nominal allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad. This political transformation was more than a change in leadership. It represented the beginning of the unification of Egypt and Syria, the first step toward creating a united front against the Crusader states. While acknowledging the religious authority of the Abbasid Caliph, Saladin established his own Ayyubid dynasty as the effective political and military power in the region. You might imagine him, in those early years of consolidation, sitting in a courtyard in Cairo as evening falls, receiving messengers from distant provinces, writing letters in elegant Arabic script, consulting maps that show the patchwork of powers between Egypt and Syria. His living quarters remain simple despite his growing authority. His personal habits are modest, though he can display appropriate splendor when diplomacy requires it. Patience marks his approach. For nearly a decade after taking power in Egypt, he focuses primarily on consolidating his position, addressing internal rivals, and extending his influence into Syria and Upper Mesopotamia. He negotiates treaties with the Crusader states when necessary, sometimes even forming temporary alliances with Frankish rulers against common rivals. Each step is measured, each alliance or conquest serving the larger strategy of unification. By the 1180s, Saladin has achieved what seemed impossible, bringing most of Egypt, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia under his control. The fragmentation that had enabled the Crusader states to survive now gives way to a unified power that surrounds them on multiple fronts. Yet even then, he does not rush to open conflict. The final catalyst comes in 1187, when the rash Crusader noble Reynaud of Châtillon attacks a Muslim caravan during a period of truce. For Saladin, who values his word as a matter of personal honor and Islamic duty, this violation cannot stand unanswered. The Battle of Hattin that follows in July 1187 represents not just a military confrontation, but a clash of strategic approaches. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, marches away from water sources in the summer heat, suffering from thirst before the battle even begins. Saladin's forces harass them with mounted archers, setting fires that add smoke to the Crusaders. Miseries. When the battle is joined on the horns of Hattin near the Sea of Galilee, the outcome is decisive. The Crusader army is virtually annihilated. The true cross, their most sacred relic, is captured. King Guy and many nobles are taken prisoner. The military backbone of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is broken in a single day. What follows demonstrates the complex character of this conflict. Saladin treats his royal captives with courtesy, offering King Guy a cool drink after the battle. Though he executes Reynaud of Châtillon with his own hand for his oath-breaking, he ransoms most captive knights but orders the execution of captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller, whom he considers the most dedicated adversaries of Islam. With the field army destroyed, the Crusader states lie vulnerable. Saladin methodically captures city after city: Acre, Jaffa, Beirut, Sidon, Ascalon. By October, only a few months after Hattin, his armies stand before Jerusalem itself. The siege is brief. The defenders, mostly civilians with few experienced fighters, hold out for less than 2 weeks before negotiating surrender terms. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem returns to Muslim control after 88 years of Christian rule. What happens next becomes one of the most commented upon contrasts in medieval history. Unlike the Crusaders in 1099, Saladin does not permit a massacre. The Christian inhabitants are allowed to purchase their freedom and depart with their movable possessions. Those who cannot afford the ransom are eventually freed anyway, some ransomed by Saladin's brother Al-Adil, others simply allowed to leave. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is closed briefly, but soon reopened to allow Christian pilgrims to visit. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had been converted to Christian uses, are purified with rosewater and restored to Islamic worship. Jerusalem changes hands not with a deluge of blood, but but with what medieval chroniclers on both sides recognize as remarkable restraint. Imagine the scene as Saladin enters Jerusalem, riding not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. He refuses to enter the dome of the rock with unwashed hands. He speaks with Eastern Christian leaders who have chosen to remain, assuring them of their continued place in the city. He establishes endowments for scholars and the poor. His victory is complete, yet he carries it with a humility that impresses even his enemies. News of Jerusalem's fall sends shockwaves through Europe, prompting calls for a new crusade. But Saladin has transformed the nature of the conflict. No longer can crusaders claim to represent a superior civilization or moral standard. His conduct holds a mirror to crusader excesses, creating a counter-narrative that resonates through centuries. In this moment of victory, as prayers once again rise from Jerusalem's mosques, the quiet strength of patience is vindicated. Water has indeed shaped stone, persistent presence has overcome transient fury, and the dust of history settles on another turning point in Jerusalem's long memory. Echoes grow fainter with each repetition, like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water. So too with the Crusades that followed the fall of Jerusalem. Each retained the form, but somehow lost the substance of what had come before, becoming more political, more complicated, sometimes more cynical in their execution. The Third Crusade responds directly to Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs take the cross: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard III, the Lionheart of England. It seems a force sufficient to reverse Saladin's victories. Yet fate intervenes when Frederick drowns while crossing a river in Anatolia, his German contingent largely dispersing afterward. Philip and Richard arrive by sea, capturing Acre after a protracted siege, but finding themselves at odds over strategy and leadership. Philip soon returns to France, leaving Richard to continue alone. What follows is less a war of conquest than a chess match between 2 brilliant commanders, Richard and Saladin, who develop a reluctant respect for each other despite never meeting face to face. Richard demonstrates tactical brilliance at the Battle of Arsuf, defeating Saladin's forces while maintaining disciplined formation, yet he lacks the manpower to retake Jerusalem. 3 times his army approaches the holy city. 3 times he withdraws, recognizing that even if he captured it, he lacks the strength to hold it after his inevitable return to Europe. Instead, the Crusade concludes with a negotiated settlement. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 leaves Jerusalem in Muslim hands, but allows Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites. Coastal cities return to Crusader control, creating a reduced but still viable Kingdom of Jerusalem centered on Acre rather than Jerusalem itself. It is an unsatisfying conclusion for both sides, yet perhaps the most realistic outcome possible. Richard sails for home shortly after, only to be captured and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria. Saladin dies the following year, his empire soon fragmenting among his heirs. Both leaders fade from the scene, having fought each other to a draw, a result that satisfies neither but preserves something for both. The Fourth Crusade that follows represents perhaps the strangest detour in crusading history. Launched in 1202, it never reaches the Holy Land at all. Assembled in Venice with insufficient funds to pay for their contracted transport, the Crusaders find themselves manipulated into attacking the Christian city of Zara in modern Croatia as compensation for the Venetian Doge. Excommunicated for this act but continuing nonetheless, the crusade then becomes entangled in Byzantine succession politics. Diverted to Constantinople, the Crusaders storm the greatest Christian city in the world in April 1204. What follows is 3 days of looting that strips the city of countless treasures: golden icons, ancient relics, bronze statues from the classical age. Much of this wealth ends up in Venice, where the bronze horses of St. Mark's Basilica still stand as testament to this extraordinary theft. The Crusaders establish a Latin empire in Constantinople that will last until 1261, a bizarre footnote that weakens Byzantium permanently and creates deeper divisions between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pope Innocent III, who had called for the crusade, is appalled at its outcome, yet powerless to undo what has been done. Subsequent crusades continue this pattern of diminishing returns. The Children's Crusade of 1212, not an official crusade, but a popular movement, leads thousands of young people from France and Germany on a tragic journey that ends in death or slavery for many. The Fifth Crusade targets Egypt rather than Jerusalem, but ends in defeat when flooding of the Nile traps the Crusader army. The Sixth Crusade under Emperor Frederick II achieves the return of Jerusalem through negotiation rather than conquest, a diplomatic triumph that lasts barely 15 years before the city is lost again. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades, led by Louis IX of France, later canonized as St. Louis, focus again on Egypt and Tunisia respectively, both ending in failure. Louis dies of disease outside Tunis in 1270, his death symbolizing the fading of crusading enthusiasm among European monarchs. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states have contracted to a few coastal enclaves. The Mamluks of Egypt, military slaves who have seized power from Saladin's successors, methodically reduce these final outposts. Acre, the last significant Crusader city, falls in 1291 after a desperate siege. Its population flees to ships in the harbour, while Mamluk forces pour through breached walls. Many drown in the desperate evacuation. The surviving refugees scatter to Cyprus and Rhodes, carrying little more than memories of a kingdom that had lasted almost 2 centuries. What remains of crusading energy finds new outlets. The Teutonic Knights redirect their efforts toward the pagan Baltic. The Knights Hospitaller establish themselves on Rhodes and later Malta, becoming a naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. The reconquest of Spain from Muslim rule continues with renewed religious fervor, culminating in 1492 with the fall of Granada. These later campaigns retain the language and some of the trappings of crusading, but lack the singular focus that had animated the First Crusade. The ideal evolves, or perhaps dissolves, as political considerations increasingly overshadow religious motivations. Crusading becomes one tool among many in the complex dynamics of medieval statecraft. Yet even as actual crusades fade, the idea maintains a powerful hold on European imagination. Crusading imagery permeates medieval literature and art. Kings and nobles continue to talk of retaking Jerusalem long after practical prospects for doing so have vanished. The Crusader ideal of armed pilgrimage in service to God remains embedded in European self-conception, even as the reality recedes into history. Perhaps that is the nature of echoes. They persist beyond the original sound, carried by air long after their source has fallen silent. The ripples continue outward, touching shores unforeseen by those who cast the first stone. Causes evolve or dissolve with time, yet leave impressions that shape landscapes both physical and spiritual long after their passing. As night deepens, and stars trace their ancient paths above lands once fought over by crusaders and defenders, we might pause to consider how these distant conflicts still cast shadows across our modern world. History breathes quietly through present tensions, and ancient dust carries whispers that remain audible to those who learn to listen. There is a particular contradiction in historical events that leave permanent impact, yet ultimately fail in their stated aims. The Crusades embody this paradox. They transformed both East and West permanently, yet their primary goal of establishing lasting Christian rule in the Holy Land evaporated like morning mist under the Mediterranean sun. By the early 14th century, the physical presence of Crusader states has vanished from the Levantine mainland. The Kingdom of Jerusalem exists only as a hollow title claimed by European monarchs who will never set foot in the city. The military orders have withdrawn to islands or European territories. Pilgrims still journey to the Holy Land, but now do so under sufferance of Muslim rulers, often paying substantial fees for the privilege. The fall of the last Crusader strongholds represents not just military defeat, but the collapse of a world view, a medieval Christian conception that saw Jerusalem as the spiritual center of the world, a place that should naturally exist under Christian governance. This idea, so powerful it had moved tens of thousands to leave their homes for dangerous journeys, could not ultimately overcome demographic, geographic, and military realities. Yet if the Crusades failed in their primary objective, they succeeded in transforming both the societies that launched them and those they targeted. Europe after the Crusades was not the same Europe that had responded to Urban II's call 3 centuries earlier. Consider the economic changes. The Crusades accelerated the growth of Italian maritime republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, whose ships transported Crusaders eastward and whose merchants established trading networks throughout the Mediterranean. These commercial connections outlasted the Crusader states themselves, creating durable economic ties between Europe and the Islamic world. Banking systems evolved to support distant crusading expeditions. The Knights Templar developed financial services that allowed pilgrims and crusaders to deposit funds in Europe and withdraw equivalent amounts in the Holy Land, an early form of international banking. Taxation systems became more sophisticated as monarchs sought to fund expensive overseas ventures. Cultural transformations proved equally significant. European contact with the more developed Islamic civilization brought new knowledge, technologies, and luxuries westward. Greek philosophical texts, preserved and developed by Muslim scholars, found their way to European universities. Medical knowledge, astronomical instruments, and agricultural techniques crossed cultural boundaries. New foods, sugar, rice, citrus fruits, and spices changed European cuisines permanently. Architectural influences flowed in both directions. Returning Crusaders incorporated elements of Islamic and Byzantine design into European buildings. The pointed arch, so characteristic of Gothic architecture, may have been inspired by Islamic precedents. Meanwhile, Crusader castles in the Holy Land blended European and local building techniques, creating distinctive structures suited to their environment. Political developments in Europe bear the Crusades' imprint as well. The expeditions accelerated the process of state formation, as monarchs who successfully led crusades often returned with enhanced prestige and authority. Royal taxation for crusading purposes established precedents that strengthened centralized governance. The weakening of Byzantium following the Fourth Crusade shifted European power dynamics permanently eastward. For the Islamic world, the Crusades prompted religious and political evolution. The emphasis on jihad as armed defense of the faith gained renewed prominence in Islamic thought. Political unification under leaders like Saladin and later the Mamluks created larger, more centralized states capable of mobilizing resources for extended conflicts. The experience of confronting external invasion fostered a heightened sense of religious identity that transcended local and ethnic differences. Yet beyond these tangible transformations lies something more elusive, the way the Crusades altered how civilizations viewed themselves and each other. For Europe, the expeditions became part of a triumphalist narrative of Christian expansion, even as they ultimately failed. For the Islamic world, successful resistance to the Crusaders became a point of pride and historical reference, though it did not prevent later Ottoman expansion into Europe. These mutual perceptions, once formed, proved remarkably durable. The Muslim memory of Christian invaders from the West and the European image of Islamic resistance to crusading incursions created mental frameworks that influenced centuries of subsequent interaction. Terms like crusade and jihad acquired layers of meaning that extended far beyond their original contexts, becoming shorthand for civilizational conflict even in modern discourse. Perhaps most significantly, the Crusades left behind human stories that history books often miss. Consider the descendants of Crusaders who remained in the East after the fall of the Crusader states. Some converting to Islam, others maintaining their Christian faith as minorities within Muslim societies. Think of the children of mixed marriages, carrying both European and Middle Eastern heritage. Imagine the cultural hybrids created when Italian merchants settled in Alexandria or Damascus, adopting local customs while maintaining connections to their homelands. These human bridges between civilizations, individuals who live between worlds, represent a counter-narrative to the more common emphasis on conflict. Even amid religious warfare, trade continued. Diplomatic exchanges persisted. Cultural borrowing occurred in both directions. The neat divisions implied by terms like Crusader and Saracen blur when examined closely, revealing complex identities that transcended rigid categories. As twilight falls on the crusading era in the 14th century, these complexities become increasingly apparent. The Ottoman Turks rise as a new power in Anatolia, eventually capturing Constantinople in 1453, an event that might be viewed as the final closure of the crusading period. Yet even as they advance into Europe, the Ottomans incorporate Byzantine administrative practices and maintain commercial relationships with Italian city-states. Conflict and coexistence continue their complicated dance. The physical remnants of the crusading era still dot landscapes across the Middle East and Mediterranean. Crac des Chevaliers stands in Syria, its massive walls now bearing scars from a much more recent conflict. The Hospitaller fortress at Rhodes continues to dominate that island's medieval city. Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre bears architectural elements from the Crusader reconstruction. These stone witnesses remind us that what feels like distant history was once lived experience. Stones laid by human hands, walls defended by people with hopes and fears, not unlike our own. In Europe, crusading memories persist in unexpected places, village churches dedicated to St. George, the military saint popular among crusaders, family names that reference Eastern origins, heraldic designs incorporating motifs brought back from the Holy Land. The cultural DNA of the Crusades has been integrated so thoroughly that its presence often goes unrecognized in daily life. Perhaps there is wisdom in recognizing that historical events never truly end. They merely transform, their energy changing form like matter in the physical world. The Crusades formally concluded centuries ago, yet their echoes continue to shape perceptions, politics, and personal identities in ways both obvious and subtle. As we drift towards sleep, let us consider how distant conflicts reach through time to touch our present moment. The dust of those ancient battles has long since settled, yet somehow remains in the air we breathe. Invisible particles of history that influence how we see ourselves and others. The Crusades remind us that the past is never truly past, but continues to live in the stories we tell and the worlds those stories create. The candle flame flickers, casting dancing shadows across carefully arranged parchment. Outside, Constantinople hums with the residual energy of a city settling into night. Inside this chamber in the Blachernay Palace, a woman in her 60s bends over her writing, her face illuminated in the warm light as her quill scratches methodically across the page. This is Anna Komnena, Byzantine princess, physician, historian, and perhaps the most educated woman of her age. Born in the purple chamber of the imperial palace in 1083 to Emperor Alexios III Komnenos and Empress Irene Doukaina, she was raised to potentially inherit the Byzantine throne. Fate had other plans when her brother John was born, but Anna's formidable intellect found expression in scholarship rather than rulership. Now, decades after the events she chronicles, she works on what will become the Alexiad, a biographical history of her father's reign, and one of our most important primary sources. On the First Crusade from the Byzantine perspective, her work represents something extraordinary. A first-hand account from a woman who observed the arrival of the first Crusaders from within the imperial palace itself. Anna's memories of that time remain vivid despite the passing years. She was 15 when the first Crusader contingents began arriving in Constantinople, old enough to observe carefully, young enough to be shaped by the experience. She recalls the initial diplomatic exchanges, the reports from imperial agents about the approaching armies, the mixture of hope and apprehension that pervaded the Byzantine court. Her father, Emperor Alexios, had sent ambassadors to Pope Urban II requesting military assistance against Turkish advances in Anatolia. What returned was something different. Massive armies of Western knights and foot soldiers, motivated by religious fervor and led by independent-minded nobles who acknowledged no overlord except, theoretically, God himself. Anna writes of these Franks, as the Byzantines called all Western Europeans, with a mixture of admiration and disdain. She respects their military prowess while finding their customs barbaric, their manners crude, their religious practices peculiar. In her account, they are physically impressive but culturally inferior, powerful yet undisciplined, devout yet greedy. She describes the arrival of Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman leader who had previously fought against Byzantium, but now came as a crusader. Her physical description reveals both aesthetic appreciation and political wariness. He was so tall in stature that he overtopped the tallest by nearly 1 cubit, narrow in the waist and flanks, with broad shoulders and chest, and powerful arms. His whole appearance was neither too slender nor overweight, but perfectly proportioned. His charm was irresistible, but he was not to be trusted. This combination of detailed observation and sharp judgment characterizes Anna's entire approach. She records the oath of fealty that her father required from Crusader leaders, the tension surrounding these ceremonies, the careful gifts exchanged to maintain fragile alliances. She understands that these Western knights represent both potential salvation against Turkish pressure and a new threat to Byzantine authority. From her palace windows, she might have watched Crusader contingents camped outside Constantinople's walls, their strange armor catching sunlight, their unfamiliar banners fluttering in Bosphorus breezes. Perhaps she attended diplomatic receptions where these foreign nobles, uncomfortable in Byzantine court ceremonial, struggled to navigate the complex etiquette of an empire that traced its lineage directly to ancient Rome. The garden courtyard fills with golden afternoon light as an elderly man settles onto cushions beneath a citrus tree. Though his beard has whitened and his back slightly bowed with age, his eyes remain sharp, observing the young scribe who positions himself nearby, reed, pen and paper at the ready. This is Usama ibn Munkid, Syrian nobleman, poet, diplomat, and warrior, dictating his memoirs in Damascus around the year 1183. Born in 1095 at the fortress of Shiza on the Orontes River, Usama's life spans nearly the entire history of the Crusader states. The year of his birth coincides with the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. By the time of his death in 1188, he will have witnessed Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem. Between these bookends, his remarkable life offers us one of the most valuable Muslim perspectives on the crusading era. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who knew the Franks only as enemies on the battlefield, Usama's diplomatic career brought him into close and regular contact with the Crusader nobility. He served various Muslim rulers including the Burid dynasty of Damascus, the Zengids, and eventually Saladin himself. These positions required frequent visits to Crusader territories and negotiations with their leaders, creating opportunities for cultural observation unusually detailed for the period. I have seen none more peculiar in their ways than the Franks, he tells his scribe, recalling encounters decades old yet still vivid in his memory. His tone contains neither the heated rhetoric of religious polemic nor uncritical admiration. Instead, he offers the measured assessment of a man who has spent a lifetime navigating between cultures, finding both commonality and unbridgeable difference. He dictates a story about Frankish medical practices that still amuses him years later. A knight with an infected leg was treated by a Muslim physician who prepared a poultice. A Frankish doctor arrived, dismissed this treatment, and asked the patient whether he preferred to die with 2 legs or live with 1. When the knight chose life, the Frankish doctor placed his leg on a block, directed a man to cut it off with an axe, and the patient died immediately. Usama concludes dryly, "They brought the knight who had suggested the treatment to another knight suffering from similar abscess, and he treated him in the same way. This one also died on the spot." Yet Usama's accounts reveal complexity rather than simple mockery. He tells of a knight from the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem who hosted him in his home, and knowing Usama was facing eastward to pray toward Mecca, stopped a Frankish visitor from disturbing his prayers, saying, "Leave him, he is praying." This same knight later apologized when other newly arrived Franks interrupted Usama's devotions, explaining, "These have only recently arrived from their lands and have never seen anyone pray except toward the east." Through such anecdotes, Usama reveals the gradual development of cultural accommodation between the first generation of Crusaders, rigid in their European ways, and those born in the Levant or resident there for decades, who had adapted to local customs and developed more nuanced understanding of their Muslim neighbors. His writing captures the strange contradictions of this period: how commerce continued amid conflict, how diplomatic relationships formed between nominal enemies, how cultural exchange proceeded despite religious division. He describes attending hunting parties with Frankish nobles, exchanging gifts with them, discussing poetry and falconry, while carefully avoiding religious disputes. Unlike chroniclers who observed the Crusades from Baghdad or Damascus, Usama experienced the frontier zones where cultures mingled. Unlike European writers who saw Muslims primarily as military opponents or religious adversaries, he portrays them as complex individuals with distinct personalities and motivations. His Christian neighbors are neither demons nor potential converts, but simply people, sometimes admirable, sometimes foolish, always recognizably human. Usama's long life encompasses repeated reversals of fortune. As a young man, he serves in the courts of Muslim rulers who struggle to resist Crusader expansion. In middle age, he witnesses the gradual unification of Muslim territories under leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and finally Saladin. As an old man, he sees the balance of power shift decisively as Saladin's forces defeat the Crusader army at Hattin and recapture Jerusalem. Through these changing tides, Usama maintains the pragmatic flexibility necessary for survival. When political circumstances force him from one court, he finds position at another. When enemies confiscate his library of thousands of volumes in Shizar, he builds another collection in Damascus. When former patrons fall from power, he cultivates new relationships with rising figures. This adaptability extends to his understanding of the Franks. Rather than viewing them as a monolithic entity, he recognizes distinctions between different Crusader groups. He notes the rivalries between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, the tensions between newly arrived Europeans and those born in the Levant, the varying attitudes toward local populations displayed by different Crusader leaders. As afternoon light lengthens shadows across the courtyard, Usama recalls a particularly telling incident. While visiting Jerusalem during a period of truce, he went to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Templars had partially converted into a headquarters. A Frank recently arrived from Europe tried to physically redirect him from praying toward Mecca. Templars who had been resident in Jerusalem longer quickly intervened, apologized to Usama, and removed the newcomer. "I returned to my prayer," Usama recounts. The man was a stranger who had just arrived from the land of the Franks and had never before seen anyone praying except toward the east. The incident encapsulates the tensions between ideology and practical coexistence that characterized life in the Crusader states. Recently arrived Europeans, steeped in anti-Islamic rhetoric and unfamiliar with Muslim practices, often displayed the greatest hostility. Those who had lived alongside Muslim populations for years had developed more nuanced attitudes, not abandoning their faith, but finding ways to accommodate differences necessary for daily interaction. These observations flow into Usama's dictation, not as formal analysis, but as lived experience. Stories told by an old man reflecting on an extraordinary life spent navigating between worlds. His book of contemplation, Kitab al-Itibar, emerges not as historical chronicle or religious polemic, but as personal memoir, filled with anecdotes that reveal deeper truths through specific incidents. As sunset approaches and the scribe's hand begins to tire, Usama recalls a friend from his youth, a Templar knight whom he considered close enough to call brother. This knight offered to send Usama's son to Europe for education, promising he would return thinking like a Frank. Usama declined politely, recognizing an unbridgeable cultural divide despite personal friendship. This capacity to maintain individual connections across religious boundaries while acknowledging their limitations characterizes Usama's worldview. Neither fanatical nor naively optimistic, he navigates cultural difference with a pragmatism born of experience. He maintains his Islamic faith and cultural identity while engaging meaningful exchanges with those who view the world differently. As shadows lengthen and the muezzin's call to evening prayer sounds from a nearby minaret, the elderly nobleman concludes the day's dictation. His memories will soon be preserved in manuscript form, though like Anna Komnena's work, they will fade from view for centuries before being rediscovered by modern historians. Yet something of his measured voice, his observant eye, his capacity to recognize complexity rather than reduce it to simplicity, continues to speak across time. In a world still struggling with religious and cultural division, Usama's memoirs offer a reminder that even in eras of conflict, individual humans found ways to connect across seemingly impermeable boundaries, never fully bridging them, perhaps, but creating spaces where recognition of shared humanity remained possible. Crusaders' victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, their sufferings during the march through Anatolia, and their eventual conquest of Antioch and Jerusalem. Her perspective remains consistently Byzantine, concerned primarily with how these events affected imperial interests rather than Crusader spiritual aims. Morning mist clings to meadows outside the small village of Claus in northern France. It is spring of the year 1096, and a man we shall call Thomas, a carpenter, with calloused hands and worry lines etched around his eyes, stands before his modest home. His wife adjusts the crude cloth cross sewn onto his cloak while their children watch with solemn faces, too young to fully comprehend why father must leave. Thomas is neither knight nor nobleman. He owns no armor, rides no war horse. He carries only a walking staff, a small knife for practical use, a leather water flask, and a pouch containing meager savings. He has never traveled more than 20 miles from his birthplace. Yet today he joins the thousands responding to Pope Urban's call, setting forth on a journey of over 2,000 miles to Jerusalem. Unlike Anna Komnena or Usama ibn Munkid, Thomas left no written record. His name appears in no chronicle. We know him only through collective records of the ordinary people who formed the largest, least documented contingent of the crusading movement. Yet his experience represents that of countless individuals whose humble faith propelled them toward a distant holy city they knew only through scripture and sermon. What moves a man like Thomas to abandon home and livelihood for such a perilous journey? The immediate catalyst comes through the village priest, who shares news of the Pope's proclamation and the promise of remission of sins for those who take the cross. But beneath this lies deeper currents, a genuine faith that sees Jerusalem not as distant geography, but as spiritual homeland, fears about personal salvation, perhaps a yearning for purpose beyond the repetitive cycles of medieval peasant life. Thomas joins a growing band of pilgrims from surrounding villages. They travel first to a larger town where a charismatic preacher, not Peter the Hermit himself, but one of many similar figures, inflames their religious fervor with vivid descriptions of Muslim desecration of holy places and promises of both spiritual and material rewards awaiting in the east. The journey begins with optimism. Spring weather proves favorable as they travel east through familiar French countryside. Villagers along the route, infected by the same religious enthusiasm, offer food and shelter. Thomas walks perhaps 15 miles daily, a sustainable pace that allows his unaccustomed body to adjust gradually to the pilgrim's life. As they cross into Germanic lands, challenges increase. Language barriers complicate interactions with local populations. Some villages welcome them, others close their doors against the swelling tide of travelers. Occasional violence erupts when hungry pilgrims take food from unwilling locals. Thomas, by nature peaceable, finds himself uncomfortable with such actions, yet understands the desperation that drives them. The band joins larger groups as they approach the Rhineland cities. Here, Thomas witnesses the darker side of crusading, fervor as local Jews become targets of violence, accused by some preachers of being enemies of Christ, equal to distant Muslims. Some pilgrims participate in these attacks. Others, Thomas among them, watch with discomfort or actively object. These incidents create the first cracks in his idealized vision of holy pilgrimage. By summer, they reach the Hungarian kingdom. Heat, dust, and diminishing supplies test faith and endurance. Thomas develops foot blisters that become infected, forcing him to ride in a cart for several days, an expense that depletes his limited funds. He begins to understand that physical suffering, rather than being merely an obstacle, has become integrated into his pilgrimage experience, each pain offered up as devotion. Autumn finds the band crossing Byzantine territory, where Thomas encounters cultural differences that challenge his worldview. Orthodox churches lack the familiar statues of his village chapel, featuring icons instead. Local Christians follow different customs, eat different foods, speak incomprehensible languages. For the first time, he confronts the reality that Christianity itself contains diversity he never imagined from his village perspective. Constantinople overwhelms his senses. Having never seen a settlement larger than a modest market town, the imperial city's scale and splendor seem almost supernatural. Walking through markets filled with silks, spices, and craftsmanship beyond anything in his experience, Thomas briefly wonders if he has already reached the heavenly Jerusalem described in sermons. The crossing into Asia Minor brings harsh new realities. Byzantine guides provide less support than expected. Turkish raids claim lives from the pilgrim band. Water sources prove scarce in unfamiliar terrain. Thomas witnesses hunger transform previously devout companions into desperate individuals, willing to steal or abandon the sick. His own faith wavers in moments of extreme thirst when prayers for relief go seemingly unanswered. By the time they reach Antioch in early 1098, Thomas has changed. His body has thinned, his skin darkened by sun, his eyes carrying both weariness and a depth of experience unimaginable to the man who left Cloyes. He has buried fellow pilgrims along roadsides with simple prayers. He has learned to communicate through gestures with Greek and Armenian Christians. He has killed once, reluctantly striking a Turkish raider who threatened an elderly pilgrim. The siege of Antioch tests him further. Military realities confine pilgrims to camp while knights conduct primary operations. Food shortages bring starvation that claims many lives. Thomas survives partly through skills developed on the journey. ability to identify edible plants, willingness to eat foods his former self would have rejected, capacity to subsist on minimal sustenance. He also builds relationships with other survivors, forming a makeshift family bound by shared hardship. When Jerusalem finally appears on the horizon in June 1099, Thomas is among a fraction of those who left France 3 years earlier. The golden dome of the rock catches sunlight, creating an image that seems to confirm every sermon he has heard about the city's divine significance. He falls to his knees, weeping with emotion complex beyond simple joy, relief, vindication, grief for those who perished before reaching this moment, gratitude for his own survival. What follows tests his faith in unexpected ways. Thomas witnesses the massacre following Jerusalem's capture, the bloody culmination that contradicts Christ's teachings of mercy he learned in village sermons. Though not directly participating in violence, he cannot avoid seeing its aftermath in streets running with blood. This cognitive dissonance, the holiest city captured through most unholy means, creates spiritual confusion he struggles to reconcile. In the following days, Thomas fulfills devotional practices he has dreamed of for years. He prays at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, touches stones where tradition claims Christ walked, follows the Via Dolorosa. Each location provides profound spiritual connection, yet simultaneously feels strangely ordinary. Physical places bearing the weight of transcendent expectations that reality cannot fully satisfy. Unlike many knights and nobles who prepare to return to Europe or establish new lives in the nascent kingdom of Jerusalem, Thomas faces a humbler decision. His pilgrim vow complete, he could remain in Jerusalem, perhaps finding work as a carpenter. He could settle in one of the coastal cities where European communities are forming. Or he could attempt the dangerous journey home to a family who may have already mourned him as dead. After weeks of prayer, Thomas chooses to return. The journey home proves no less arduous than the outbound passage, though his hardened body and accumulated experience make him better equipped for its challenges. He travels with a smaller band of returning pilgrims, their pace slowed by injuries and illness accumulated during years of travel and siege. When Thomas finally crests the familiar hill overlooking Cloyes in summer of 1101, more than 5 years have passed since his departure. The village appears unnervingly unchanged. The same church spire, the same pattern of fields, the same rhythm of life continuing as though he had never left. Yet Thomas himself has been transformed beyond recognition. His family receives him, as if welcoming a ghost. His wife had performed mourning rituals 2 years earlier after pilgrims brought news of mass deaths at Antioch. His children, now approaching adolescence, regard this thin, weathered stranger with cautious curiosity. The neighbors gather to hear tales of distant lands and miraculous survival. Yet Thomas finds his experiences almost impossible to convey. How can he explain Constantinople's grandeur to people who have never seen a city? How can he describe desert heat to those who have never left temperate forests? How can he convey the complexity of his spiritual journey? Faith tested, lost, regained in different form. In the years that follow, Thomas returns to carpentry, but never fully reintegrates into village life. He becomes both respected and slightly feared, a living reminder of a world beyond local experience. On winter evenings, children and adults gather to hear his stories, which grow both embellished and edited with each telling. The darkest moments, cannibalism during the Antioch siege, massacres in Jerusalem, fade from his narrative, replaced by emphasis on miraculous preservation and spiritual fulfillment. When Thomas finally dies in 1123, he leaves behind more than memories. He leaves behind a wooden cross, carved by his own hand from olive wood brought back from Jerusalem, a relic he never displayed publicly, but which his grandchildren would later claim gave protection to the household during storms. He leaves a patchwork journal, started years after his return, containing not precise chronicles, but reflections and prayers in a rough script. His handwriting is slow and deliberate, each letter shaped with the same care he once gave to mortise and tenon joints in the beams of homes. In these final pages, we catch a glimpse of a transformed man. Not quite priest, not quite warrior, not quite villager. Thomas writes not of glory, but of paradox, the holiness found in suffering, the mercy hidden in silence, the sacredness of ordinary bread shared under siege. He writes of friends whose names no one else remembers, of small acts of kindness in foreign lands, of moments when light broke through despair, not in visions or miracles, but in the simple act of surviving another day. To the world of chronicles and history books, Thomas remains invisible, but to those who knew him, his children, the apprentices who learned carpentry beneath his quiet gaze, the villagers who paused to hear his tales by the fire, he becomes a different kind of saint. Not canonized, not clad in armor, not captured in stained glass. A saint of endurance, of ordinary faith, of journeys walked with blistered feet and trembling heart. In Thomas, we see not the exceptional, but the essential, the kind of anonymous soul without whom no movement, no era, no pilgrimage can truly be understood. His was not the path of conquest, but of transformation. His memory is not etched in marble, but in the minds of those who heard his voice tremble when he spoke of standing in the Holy Sepulchre, and in the way his youngest son began carving small crosses long after Thomas was gone. The humble pilgrim, unknown to history, but not to life. His journey, like so many, did not end at Jerusalem. It ended, as all true pilgrimages do, in a changed heart, a quiet return, and the sacred labor of living differently after witnessing the world. And now, you drift back to your bed. The dust of ancient roads begins to settle, and the clamor of swords fades into the hush of moonlight on your window. The world of banners and barefoot pilgrims, of emperors and silent stone chapels, slowly dissolves like a parchment curling in fire's last breath. You are no longer in Jerusalem, nor Antioch, nor Rome. You are here, softly wrapped in your blankets, breathing in rhythm with the slow turning of the earth, and yet something lingers. Perhaps it's the memory of a mother stitching a red cross onto her son's tunic, or the silence that followed a priest's trembling prayer at dawn, or the uneasy image of holy hands soaked in blood. The Crusades were not only fought on fields, they were fought in hearts, in decisions made under stars, in the tension between what we believe is right and what we do in its name. These echoes still live within us, in every conflict where ideology overrides empathy, in every border drawn between us and them, in every quiet soul who asks, is this truly what God wills? And yet, just as surely, in every act of mercy, in every journey taken not for conquest but for understanding, the better angels of those old stories still sing, faintly, like bells across water. Let this moment hold space for all the forgotten voices. The peasants who walked barefoot to sacred ground, the children who waited at hearths now cold, the horses who fell in dust and never rose again, the women who survived alone, lighting candles that no one saw, and the many, many others whose names were never written down, but whose choices, hopes and grief shaped history all the same. You've travelled far tonight, through stone cities and cracked lips, through sermons and sultans, through contradictions wrapped in gold and blood. But now is the time to return, not just to the comfort of your bed, but to yourself. Feel your chest rise and fall. Let the stories loosen their grip, their weight transformed into mist. History does not end with answers. It lingers in questions. And you, resting quietly now, are part of that long, unbroken chain of wondering. So breathe in and let go. The candles have burned low. The horses are stabled. The banners have been folded and placed away. There is nothing more to understand tonight. Only this. You were there. You listened. And now, you rest. Good night, traveler. The past is quiet now. Let sleep carry you the rest of the way.